not the personalities that are engaging in making it so, as opposed to whatever rules or processes we have. Because, frankly, one of the problems is the unwillingness, in my opinion, to come to grips with making decisions in a timely fashion. I'll talk a little bit about that. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today about the importance of modernizing Congress to make it more accountable and responsive to those it serves. One of the ways I believe we can achieve these goals is by giving members the opportunity to have a greater say in directing spending toward critical public projects in their communities. I may sound like a broken record, but yes, I'm talking about restoring earmarks, which I believe can be instruments of good when done in a way that is fully transparent and accountable. When Democrats were last in the majority, we reformed the earmark process substantially, requiring members to post all their earmark requests online and justify every dollar. We banned earmarks to private entities and required members to certify they had no financial interest as well. Transparency and accountability fixed what was wrong with earmarks in earlier years. Eliminating them altogether, which was a winning talking point, but a misguided policy, has had the effect of taking Congress out of key funding decisions. No executive branch official knows our districts better than we do, period. No president knows our districts better than we do. Taking ourselves out of the place where we can help our districts in targeted spending to public entities in a transparent way, I think has undermined the effectiveness not only of the appropriations process, but the relationship between members and their districts. I think we've estranged ourselves to some degree from those who have, whether it's a sewer problem, a water problem, a dredging problem, whatever the problem may be that we could assist on. We've undermined our ability to do that. I believe it's time to bring earmarks back. I also believe it's time to address the issue of member, staff, and pay and benefits. We are not competitive any longer, either with the executive department and certainly not with the private sector. We have undermined our ability as the executive department has grown, as populations have increased. We have undermined and reduced our ability to oversee the application of federal dollars and the performance of agencies. And I think that we have, in effect, disarmed ourselves in responding to our responsibilities. Americans ought to have our nation's diversity on economic backgrounds better reflected in this House as well. The cost, and now I'm talking about pay and benefits for members as well as for staff. Americans ought to have our nation's diversity of economic backgrounds better reflected, as I said, in this House. The cost of rent, child care, and other necessities has risen substantially in Washington and across the country in recent years, but members and staff pay and benefits have not kept pace with the private sector. So to the extent that we undermine our ability to hire top talent and keep top talent, they may get here for a couple of years, but the competition is so keen with the executive department and certainly the private sector. I don't expect we're going to compete with their salaries, but if we don't compete on some level, we will lose the talent that we need to do our job properly. Others are choosing to leave mid-career, and the results are that we lose expertise and institutional knowledge. If we want to attract more diverse group of Americans to run for office and work on Capitol Hill, we need to make it possible for them to do so. The other area where I believe we can take significant steps is to modernize Congress with technology. Mr. Graves, I heard your statement, you mentioned that. I've worked with Mr. Hurd and Mr. McCarthy on that. I was proud to partner with Leader McCarthy in recent years to host a hackathon and release legislative data in new forms that can be used by digital platforms to make our work more accessible to those outside Capitol Hill. We've talked about transparency. This is, of course, one of the best ways we can make that so. The Whip Watch app, I don't know how many of you Republicans have watched our Whip Watch app, but it is very effective. I launched it in 2015 and updated in 2017, has brought floor proceedings and updates directly into the hands of members, staff, and the general public. And I'm pleased to share with you that in the coming days, my office will be releasing the latest version of this app with a new name and a lot of exciting new features. But plenty more needs to be done to modernize congressional technology. I've been working with Leader McCarthy on a bill to create Congressional Digital Service, modeled after President Obama's successful U.S. digital service. The idea is to assemble a group who can create a new system of online tools. We must also find a secure way to adopt within Congress the latest industry-leading cloud software tools. American businesses are seeing rapid gains in efficiency and usability through the adoption of these tools, and we must not allow government to fall behind. I want to recommend that this committee look to initiatives like the Bulk Data Task Force, the Communications with Congress Project, and docs.house.gov for examples on how to modernize government technology by putting members back in the driver's seat of funding decisions, by making it easier for citizens to step up and serve, and by using technology to increase transparency and responsiveness. We can modernize the Congress and make it work for the people in a way our founders intended. I want to thank the committee for this opportunity to appear and close as I began. No matter what processes we adopt, no matter how transparent we are, if we don't have a commitment as individual members of this Congress to make this institution work in a positive, productive way for the citizens, no process is going to make us do that. I hope we can all do that together. We can disagree, but in terms of the process of having decisions come forward and make those decisions in a transparent way, that we should not disagree on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman.
And with that, the committee will now welcome the testimony of Congressman Bill Foster from the state of Illinois. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Kilmer and Vice Chair Graves. So I'm going to be speaking briefly on a number of topics. I guess I'll start out by one that ought to be small and non-controversial, which is, the page call buttons that are underneath the seats. Those should be replaced by cell phone charging outlets. All right. So if you can't agree on anything else, you ought to be able to agree on that one. The next thing I'd like to I don't know how we discuss this, but the rebalancing the jurisdictions of the standing committees. They are ridiculously out of balance. We're in a situation where the incoming members of, at least the Democratic members, all wanted to be on Energy and Commerce, and none of them got on, simply because the Energy and Commerce jurisdiction is ridiculously large. Whether they wanted to work on climate, whether they wanted to work on health care, they all got vectored to the same place, and it didn't work. Another big shortfall in the way we distribute those jurisdictions is that Congress needs a information technology full standing committee. Technology just passed financial services as a fraction of GDP. They crossed it about 17%. All right, and so, yet we have, I think there are 7 committees that claim they're doing some part of information technology, which means that no one is. And you saw the result in, the Facebook hearings. If you step back and say, well, how would we divide jurisdictions so they, for example, represent reasonably equal fractions of the GDP instead of the economy of 100 years ago, you could say, all right, tech, it's about 15 to 20% of GDP. Financial services, between 15 and 20% of GDP. Healthcare alone, it's around 20% of GDP. Probably should be bundled up with VA. VA is actually, because the declining number of veterans is something that will be transferred to the private sector over time and should be thought about in terms of planning together. So that, I think bundling science, energy, and climate into a single committee makes sense. You cannot separate science policy from energy policy. And so those four bundles, each representing between 15 and 20% of GDP, would be very good equal jurisdictions that would represent the modern economy. You may want to decide to punt on this and simply to recommend that a follow-on committee actually makes these hard choices. You may decide that the thing to do is to make those hard choices effective, not immediately, but a decade from now, so that members of Congress can plan their careers to be on the committees that will put them in the long-term place they want to be. Another structural change I think would be transformative is to make the discharge petitions anonymous as they were before, signing a discharge petition anonymous as they were before 1993. It used to be that when you signed on to a discharge petition, the speaker did not know that you signed on to it. There is a large class of things. For example, I can easily imagine some deal which provided modest wall funding in exchange for the DREAM Act, for example, that could easily get a clear majority of members of Congress, out of the middle. There would be objections from both the left and the right, but you could get a clear majority. No one would sign on to such a discharge petition if it had to be public, because, of course, you'd get punished by the leadership. And both Democrats and Republicans, regularly do this. If we go back to the rules the way they were prior to 1993 and it's anonymous, then that would be a feasible thing. You would actually enable sort of entrepreneurial groups of moderates to come up with proposals where the 51% comes out of the middle of the House instead of entirely out of one caucus. If a good starting point to educate yourself on that is the Wikipedia article on discharge petitions. So that's another thing. The issue of increased salaries, both for members and for staff, is something that Steny mentioned, and it's fundamental in trying to get the kind of quality of staff and members we want. I think in terms of member pay, the simplest way is to scale the member pay with the median income in the United States. That aligns our incentives perfectly, and I love the idea of someone having their spouse yell at them for what have you done today to increase the median income in the United States, because I want a salary increase. In terms of staff pay, I think the most promising initiative there would be to have an endowed foundation, an endowment that would pay the salaries of highly paid staff members. You could have it funded, for example, with the estates of dead billionaires so that there would be no conflict of interest, but you'd have a large endowment, multi-billion-dollar endowment that would provide every member of Congress several more than $100,000 salaries on their staff. And with salaries like that, you could keep these young, wonderful, bright kids that serve on your staff until they have a family and then have to quit. And so this would be a way that, without any conflicts of interest, I know that there are billionaires who would be willing to fund this because they're frustrated when they come to Congress and the person they meet with is a young person. And then finally, the Office of Technology Assessment has to be reconstituted. This served for 20 years. All it has to do is be refunded. The funding was cut off in 1993, and that was a historic mistake. And in my written testimony, I will go into the details. If we had taken at least some of the advice of the OTA, it would have paid the cost of the OTA many times over. Anyway, I want to thank you for what you're taking on here, and do good.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you for your testimony. Next up, from Virginia, Don Beyer. Leave the on-deck circle and come into the batter's box. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, and Mr. Beyer, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for constituting this committee. It's fun to listen to Bill Foster because he's so incredibly thoughtful. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. I love serving the U.S. House, but I'm often dismayed by the chaos of the schedule. Enormous amounts of time are wasted every day because we don't know when the various vote series are going to start, when they're going to end, and sometimes what we aren't even going to be voting on. I had the great privilege of presiding over the Virginia Senate for 8 years, down the hall from the oldest continuously meeting legislative body on the planet. And we were extraordinarily productive and efficient, but we also had a most orderly process for considering legislation. I won't debate the wisdom or necessity of approaching every controversial piece of legislation with a rule, because with 435 independent voices necessitates some limits on amendments on the House floor. And to the best of my knowledge, there's no such limit in committee. However, I believe the House will be well served by establishing a specific start time every day and focusing all of our energy on one series of votes. In this way, committee and subcommittee hearings, office meetings, even off-campus activities can be planned much more logically and predictably. The Virginia way would suggest starting at 10 a.m., as today, for the official call to order, the prayer, the Pledge of Allegiance, the appropriate number of 5-minute and 1-minute speeches, and then the House would be in recess until 12 noon. And at noon, almost every House member would be in the chamber for the first and only vote series. Amendments made in order by the Rules Committee would be the first priority, followed by a vote on final passage of the legislation that was debated the previous day, followed by requested votes on suspension bills, and finally, the consideration of rules for bills to be considered on the following day. So instead of running back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, we would come, we would focus, we would work, we would do our job, and then we get back to the many, many other priorities that go into being a successful legislator. After the final votes, the House would immediately move to debate the rule for legislation to be considered 2 days from then, the rule the next day, the legislation 2 days. And then the House would hear debate on the legislation to be considered the next day on the rule that was just adopted earlier that day. And then after this, suspension bill is considered again with requested ayes and nays to be held the next day. So now with 2 vote series at least per day and each opening vote consuming 35 to 45 minutes, every member wastes at least an hour, probably much more, just hanging around trying to find some way to be productive. While I'm at it and recognizing that I have the shortest commute of any member, I might also recommend that we consider longer weeks, but fewer of them. Everything in life has 3 parts, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the beginnings and the endings contribute little, but they take a lot of time. So effective management, pick up any Harvard Business Review book, says you want to maximize the time in the middle, because that's when all the work gets done. So why not schedule 5-day work weeks, maybe 2 weeks at a time and then a week or 2 off? Actually fly in on Sundays, start Monday morning at 10, work through Friday. Assume maybe folks stay for the weekend. You do the same number of days you work now, but just with much more time at home, much less time on airplanes and in airports, and a lot more work getting done. So thank you for listening to me. There has to be a much more sensible way, and I suspect most of our state legislatures have figured this out. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you. The committee now welcomes the testimony of Congressman David Trone from the state of Maryland. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Mr. Trone, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
You got 2 business guys in a row.
Welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Kilmer, Ranking Member Graves, Select Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I'd like to speak about 2 issues I believe will improve the functioning of the House of Representatives and strengthen our ability to exercise Article I responsibilities. First, we should expand opportunities for young Americans to gain valuable work experience through paid internships. Second, we should open the doors of the House to the latest technology and brilliant technological minds. Paid internships. I come from the business world. In my business, we call our employees team members, because that's what we are. We're all part of a team. One thing I learned in business, we should pay our team well. Whether it's in the C-suite or a summer intern, everybody deserves to make a fair wage. When starting my congressional office, one of the most important things was to create a strong paid internship program. As a person who grew up on a farm that went bankrupt, I'm fully aware of the financial constraints an individual or a family might be facing. But taking an unpaid position growing up would have been out of the question for me. That's why we must make sure that as a body, we're not discriminating against individuals because of their socioeconomic status or financial means. Everybody of all socioeconomic status needs to have the ability to take an internship, not just the wealthy few. We must ensure the pipeline to Congress is robust and reflects the diversity of all of our districts. While I'm grateful the House Appropriations Committee has provided some funding for paid internships this year, I urge this committee to support additional funding for paid internships, not just on Capitol Hill, but also in the district offices. Technology, I believe Congress is making it hard to represent our constituents and exercise Article I by not investing in the latest technology. As I mentioned, I come from the private sector. Investing in technology is absolutely the key to our success. If customers want to buy a product online, you can find a way to make it happen. If you don't, your business fails. Congress is no different, except in this case, our constituents are our customers, the people we serve. Congress isn't meeting the needs of our constituents. If you need proof, look no further than our dismal approval ratings. Therefore, I'd urge this committee to explore creating a congressional version of the United States Digital Service, which deploys technology experts to bring private sector best practices to the federal government. For example, right now, these dedicated Americans are making it easier for veterans to upgrade their discharge status and modernizing our paper-based immigration system. Imagine what could happen with a team of technology experts dedicated to bringing these same efficiencies to Congress. We could create an online portal for constituents who have pending casework for a member of Congress. The portal will allow constituents to see the status of their case in real time. We can make it easier for Americans to contact members of Congress through whatever means is convenient. Members should be able to hear from their constituents via texting, social media, just like emails and phone calls, and yes, faxes. And we could democratize our committee hearings by allowing Americans in real time to comment and weigh in on issues being considered by the committee. So much for the great work our committees goes unnoticed because it's hard for Americans every day to engage. These are a few ideas the digital service could pursue. Thank you for the opportunity for sharing this work, and thank you for your engaging efforts in these areas.
Thank you. Thanks for your testimony. Appreciate it. With that, the committee now welcomes the testimony of Congresswoman Kathleen Rice from the state of New York. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. And Congresswoman Rice, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Kilmer and Ranking Member Graves, for holding this important hearing. Like you, I think it's crucial that we continue to look for ways to strengthen and improve the rules and processes that govern this legislative body. I'm going to keep my remarks brief and take this time to discuss an issue that's very important to me and needs to become more important to Congress as a whole, and that is cybersecurity. Last Congress, I introduced House Resolution 585, a bipartisan bill that would require all members of the House to undergo annual cyber and information security training within 30 days of being sworn in. The bill would also require all members to complete an annual training by January 31st of each year. Today, we are facing the constant and unprecedented threat of cyber attacks on our government, political organizations, and private sector entities, and members of Congress have an obligation to help protect the systems we use. As a member of the Homeland Security Committee, I have and will continue to spend considerable time working to strengthen our government's cybersecurity infrastructure, whether it's our election systems, our power grids, or our government offices. We need to make cybersecurity a part of our daily lives, and we need to play an active role in supporting those efforts. Our employees and House officers are already required to take mandatory information security training each year, and I believe members should be held to the exact same standards. After all, members spend a considerable amount of time using the very technology that foreign adversaries are trying to infiltrate every day. There's no reason why we shouldn't bear the same responsibility for combating these threats as everyone else in our offices. As we continue to beef up our cybersecurity infrastructure in different areas of government, we need to remember that members of Congress and our offices remain prime targets for malign foreign actors. My bill represents a critical step towards strengthening our cybersecurity capabilities here on Capitol Hill and ensuring that all members are equipped with the tools and knowledge to play an active role in countering cybersecurity threats. This is about making Congress a more secure place to work, and it's about leading by example. I urge this committee to consider this bill in any legislative agenda that it ultimately develops, and I thank you very much for the time to speak to you. Thank you.
Question. So I appreciate the legislation. So this committee can look at rules changes too. Does it require legislation to implement this, or is this something that the House rules could require?
I think the House rules can do, I think they do it by requiring members of the office to do it, and I think they can do it for members.
Okay. Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Speaking of House rules, I should thank the Rules Committee for letting us use their room and for their help in setting this up. With that, the committee now welcomes the testimony of Mike Gallagher. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Mr. Gallagher, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chair Graves. I appreciate it. Had I known 2 years ago that this committee would be in existence, I probably would have chosen my words on reform more carefully, and thereby given myself a chance to be appointed to the committee. But I actually view your work as the most important work that we'll do this Congress, and I say that in all seriousness. I recognize that I'm still a relatively new member of Congress, and so I'm sure what I have to say will induce some eye-rolling, but it's my belief, and I think I'm not alone in that belief, that until we change the process through which Congress operates, the people may change, the jerseys may change every 2 years, but the results will be roughly the same. And until we confront that growing lack of trust and faith by the American people in the institution of Congress, we're going to continue to get worse outcomes. So I'd like to talk about one source of problem and a corresponding solution, and that's the budget process. It's my belief that the current division between authorizing and appropriating committees, which goes back to the days of John Quincy Adams, and ironically was intended as a way to avoid shutdowns, continuing resolutions, dysfunction, and policy finding its way into appropriations bills, has itself become a recipe for shutdowns, continuing resolutions, and gigantic omnibus bills. I believe we need a budget process that drives Congress towards compromise rather than polarization, and that encourages consistent legislative work rather than creating periodic crises. We can all agree that our budget process is broken. We are, in fact, just a few weeks removed from the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, and though this latest shutdown was longer than usual, it is now common for Congress to budget by crisis, and this chaotic budget process and related shutdowns make no sense to the people who elected us. It doesn't have to be this way. I believe you could get a random group of people from any one of our districts, certainly from the great state of Wisconsin, where me and Mr. Pocan are from, get them together, and in about 30 minutes they could solve a lot of this stuff. But the process is so dysfunctional here that we have a problem having an honest debate. So we've talked about reforming the budget process for years. It should be clear by now that our inability to follow regular order poses a direct threat to the health of this body and our nation. Look at everything every incoming speaker has said about the need to restore regular order. It then quickly gets forgotten. We, Congress, are supposed to be the central player under our Constitution, but we no longer are. We have surrendered all of our authority to the executive branch, particularly when it comes to the power of the purse. And I believe that the barrier between the work of the authorizers and appropriators is a major source of congressional weakness. One of the main reasons Congress has lost its central role is because the budget process has severed the power of the purse from the basic legislative work we do every day. We can make that legislative work more meaningful for all members by uniting the authorization and appropriations processes. This would give the committees the ability to work on reaching numerous smaller agreements throughout the year, rather than waiting for the appropriators to agree on a large and at times unwieldy package that is more likely to end in gridlock. We should begin by simplifying the committee structure, perhaps by reducing the total number of committees to better correspond with the number of major executive branch departments and agencies. This is not a new idea. A committee similar to yours in 1973, the Bowling Committee, I believed, actually recommended this idea. We never did it. And then the Patterson Committee in 1980 actually went back and said, no, we should have implemented the 1973 reform. So we go through this every time. We recommend a consolidation and to change the committee structure, but for some reason we never do it. Critically, I believe healthcare could be consolidated into a single House Health Committee, which would be positioned to take a more holistic view of our healthcare system, and at the same time, in order to jumpstart our stalled budgetary and appropriations procedures, the appropriations and authorizing functions could be combined with the duties of the Appropriations Committee reassigned to other standing committees. These committees would both authorize and appropriate funds for the activities of the executive branch agencies they oversee. I know this is a radical change. I know I'm new, and I'm sure there's things I'm not talking about, but time and again, if you look at the history of congressional reform, the successful periods have been one in which they have restructured the committee process and devolved power back down to every single committee. That was the result of the reforms in the 40s, led by another great Wisconsinite, Bob La Follette Jr., and I believe that is a task before us. In order to make Congress itself more powerful, we have to make the work of each committee and each committee member more meaningful every single day. Thank you for listening to me, and I wish you the best of luck on this critical, critical mission that you have.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Gallagher. And with that, I'll invite up Susan Davis from the state of California. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. And Congresswoman Davis, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you very much. Chairman Kilner and Vice Chairman Graves, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to testify and for all that you're doing to try and bring the legislative branch up to modern standards. We all look forward to your report. As chairwoman of the House Franking Commission, I'm going to use most of my time today to share some franking recommendations. And outside of franking, I also am going to share proposals related to modernizing how the House handles classified information, co-sponsorships, and caucuses. Starting with franking. We need to first make franking rules more fitting for modern communications. The Franking Commission sees all of our members' unsolicited mass communications and mailers, from emails to glossy mailers, digital advisements, flyers, robocalls, text messages, and more. We work with practically every office and often hear frustrations about some of the most archaic franking rules. Members should be able to communicate in more effective ways, which help build trust and humanize our efforts in Congress. People want to have better access to their representatives, engage in the legislative process. They do not want us to. They don't want us to be spoken to. They don't want to be spoken to. They want two-way communications with members and two-way conversations. So the rules are important, and they protect taxpayer resources from being used for campaign, personal, and political purposes. But these rules also have yet to see any comprehensive updates since 1998. Not since the internet was just beginning to hit the mainstream, and long before social media and smart devices ever became a part of everyday life. So right now, it can be difficult to tell members what is frankable and what is not, because we often have to rely on precedent rather than rules designed for modern communication like social media. The rules, of course, are there, but they are sometimes nitpicked into oblivion and other times made completely open-ended. With updates to political ad disclosures on Facebook and video prioritization across all social media, I do believe that we all should find ways to enable cost-effective approaches to optimize ad targeting and promotion, and bolster the ways that members can generate comprehensive content relative to their representational duties. So we're in the process of updating the rules, and we ask for your support with that. And second, we are behind our times when it comes to transparency. In an era when constituents can follow our actions online and see our financial disclosures, campaign reports, and office spending online, they should be able to access our frank mail and our communications also. We built an electronic approval system for frank material, and it's technically available to the public. But you could only see it if you come to Washington, go to the clerk's office, and pay 10 cents a page to print it. Even worse, the current user interface requires the people viewing public records to identify themselves. I believe it's simply good government to let the public view the frank materials they've paid for without being asked for personal information about themselves. It's definitely a turnoff if anybody takes the time to come and do this. I'll be announcing soon that frank materials will be available online, and I hope the Select Committee will support that action. Third, we would like to see the Modernization Committee, the House Administrative Committee, and the Ethics Committee work with us to find better ways to develop and use members' outreach programs and contact lists. Constituents and new members are very confused about how they can stay in touch. Can it be somebody who communicates with them, who's outside the district? Can they opt in? There are a lot of questions around that, and I think it's important that we try and make that clear. We should find opportunities to develop modern, real-world standards for opt-in programs and identify ways to maintain good contact list hygiene. I look forward to further discussion about these and other franking modernization topics. I want to turn now to another area. I also serve on the Armed Services Committee, which, as you all know, is responsible for overseeing the Department of Defense and portions of the Department of Energy. Without putting too fine a point on this, we oversee a number of matters that are highly classified, but unfortunately, the House and Senate are simply not equipped to conduct thorough oversight of classified national security issues. From the lack of staff access and secure space to a reliance on paper documents, we are falling behind, and we must bring this process into the 21st century. My written testimony actually contains several common sense proposals to address these situations, and I hope the committee can address these issues, and certainly we don't have the kind of time to go through all that right now. On another note, my staff has brought it to my attention that much legislative and clerk's office staff time could be saved if we could modernize the way we add co-sponsors to bills. Many of us sign on to the same bills over and over again every Congress, and the staff spend countless hours collecting the same names. And then the clerk spends many hours processing the information, which comes to them on handwritten sheets of paper and is easily misread. So much time could be saved if this system was online, and it could even have more accountability if done well. I believe we could also do something similar with the way we sign up for caucuses. This is something that, we all try and follow all the caucuses, but it's not an easy thing to do. It could be done through a website more easily than through emails and phone calls repeatedly for both us and for staff, or members and staff. And my written testimony contains a proposal from my staff about how to do this, and we are willing to develop it further if the committee is interested. Thank you again for your time today and for helping to make Congress work better. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And with that, the committee now welcomes the testimony of Congresswoman Anna Eshoo from California. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman Graves. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. Congress has a rich and illustrious history tied to some of the most important events in our nation's history. But this great institution is very much stuck in the past when it comes to how it conducts much of its business. And that must change, and this committee, I think, is the tip of the spear to make this change possible. I'm here today because members of Congress and congressional staff need a wake-up call. We need to wake up to the reality that we're being targeted by foreign adversaries for hacking and electronic surveillance. We are all high-value targets because of the important and often confidential work we do. Our adversaries want to exploit us, to weaken and destabilize our democratic institutions. And the House is one of those major democratic institutions. Like most Americans, members of Congress and staff spend a great deal of each day communicating through digital means. We email, text, we use apps and social media, and we store our personal and sensitive information online. The House has protections for official accounts, requires staff to complete basic cybersecurity training, and secures digital information. However, many members and staff do not realize that communications on personal devices are also not only valuable, but they're vulnerable. We know that major cyber attacks have been carried out by foreign adversaries against campaign committees, like the DNC hack in 2016 and the NRCC hack in 2018. Members of Congress have also been targeted individually in their official capacity and their unofficial capacity by a complex set of foreign actors and adversaries. Last year, the Department of Homeland Security publicly acknowledged the existence of International Mobile Subscriber Identity, the IMSI catchers, known as stingrays, here in Washington. These devices can eavesdrop on our calls. They can track our location and plant malware on our devices. These attacks are not isolated to the United States. In January, hundreds of German lawmakers and public figures were hacked and had their personal information published online. And in 2015, Germany's government network was breached by hackers. Last month, the computer network of the Australian Parliament was breached by what Australian authorities believe was a, quote, sophisticated state actor, unquote, ahead of Australia's federal elections, which are scheduled to be held this May. While Congress has dedicated personnel in place to monitor and address cyber vulnerabilities, I'm concerned, I'm really very worried, and that's the best word to use, that many members and staff are still relying on non-secure technology. Encrypted messaging, multi-factor authentication, and regular and advanced cyber hygiene training should all be basic standards for members and staffs. So that's why I'm here today, to urge the committee to really closely examine how Congress currently protects our institution and those who work here from increasingly complex cyber threats and identify steps we can take to strengthen the protections and implement more steps, because I believe they're needed. I'll just close by quoting FBI Director Christopher Wray, who said last week at RSA's annual Cybersecurity conference, quote, "The scope, the breadth, the depth, the sophistication, the diversity of the threats is unlike anything we've had in our lifetimes," unquote. So I think we have some work to do, and it will strengthen, this is all meant to strengthen this democratic institution. And I thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to working with you and helping you in any way possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your testimony and for your leadership on these issues.
Thank
too.
you.
With that, the committee now welcomes the testimony of Congressman Dean Phillips from Minnesota. Without objection, your written statement will be part of the record. And Mr. Phillips, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chair, and committee members. And most of all, gratitude to all of you. I think the work that you are doing on this committee is integral to a successful future for our country. In all of my travels and visits with the good people of Minnesota, I hear a very consistent message. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican, we want you to work together to make our lives better. It's the same challenge that businesses overcome every day, and exactly what I came to Congress to do: inspire innovation, promote collaboration and efficiency, and make things better for people in Minnesota and throughout the United States. So it won't surprise you that I've been very disappointed by the social, physical, and environmental design of Congress, and the recognition that there are not many spaces here that encourage collaborative and innovative outcomes. And what I mean by that is real physical space, the way that our buildings, our offices, and our public spaces are designed, to the very furniture that we use throughout the Capitol, lots of heavy, dark wood and leather. I came to Congress after a successful career in the private sector, where I learned that social and physical design are key determinants of positive outcomes. So picture for a moment the typical office, cafeteria, and public spaces in Longworth, for example, and compare that to the most successful and innovative business and retail environments of the 21st century. Think of your local Apple store, the open floor plan, the way it removes every non-essential feature and puts nothing in between people, products, and ideas. You see the same thing in the office layouts of Google, Tesla, and thousands of other innovative companies that recognize the power of social and physical design. Consider that the very foundation of Congress is a place for meeting, collaborating, ideating, representing, and then converting all of that into legislation. And yet we operate in dark, compartmentalized offices that were the hallmark of the 19th century, designed to segregate, not collaborate. Similarly, our furniture, as like I said, is dark wood, leather, heavy, and tired. Our office space is cramped and uninspired, and even finding a simple meeting room is often difficult throughout our buildings. I believe that we must become intentional about using physical spaces to bring people together, and it's more than a metaphor. It's integral to a successful legislative body. Now, I'm not saying we need to tear down all of our buildings and start over, but as we look to the future and the eventual need for new spaces to do our work, it is my hope that we can look to the very best American enterprises for inspiration and even collaboration, identify best practices, and bring them to a place that surely needs them. Moving from physical to social design, I see a similar opportunity to improve how members of Congress interact with one another on a bipartisan basis, particularly in an era in which respect and decency are in rapid decline. I believe that we should start as far upstream as possible and redesign the entire new member orientation program, which represents a monumental and currently missed opportunity to foster trusting relationships amongst freshmen. This must be intentional, and it does not happen by itself. We should begin orientation by getting to know one another, by participating in team-building exercises, and by allowing each new member to share his or her life story in a full group setting. Only through hearing one another's life experiences can we fully understand the lens through which we each view our world, our country, and the policies for which we advocate. By sharing one another's truths, we can illuminate our paths to respect, trust, and eventually collaboration. Every new member brings experiences to Congress that, if better articulated and understood, can generate significantly improved outcomes for the people that we represent. So I ask that the Select Committee include in its final recommendations improvements to the social, physical, and environmental design of Congress. It is time that we bring the very best of American ingenuity and possibility to a place that desperately needs it if we ever hope to function at the level that Americans hope and expect. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Before you get up, can I just ask you, was your orientation for new members, did they separate Democrats and Republicans?
I think it's fair to say that there was little intention to bring us together. I won't opine on whether that is intentional, but there were wonderful opportunities to convene and collaborate and get to know one another, separate buses oftentimes, and it's seemingly an intent to keep us apart rather than put us together. And that's my entire notion. I think Mr. Timmons, a fellow freshman, and I have spoken about this as well. We should be intentional about bringing us together. That's what Americans want us to do. And if we don't start on the first days of our service, it's awfully hard to do so thereafter.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. With that, let me invite up Congressman Jody Arrington from the state of Texas. Without objection, your written testimony will be made part of the record. And Mr. Arrington, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to comment on your last witness and the question you asked, I remember as a freshman walking into the chamber for the first time in my life, and I actually sat with the Democrats. I was the only Republican to do so. And it was like, I won't say which one were the sheep and the goat, but it was like dividing the sheep and the goats from the very outset. It seemed a little odd that the socialization of division was started so early in the process. But I'm proud that the 115th Congress, that my colleagues, both Republican and Democrats, committed to restoring civility, because we can modernize this thing all we want, but if we don't change the culture of Washington and the politics in this place and some of the structural deficiencies, then we'll just have a more efficient way of running right off the cliff and not solving the problems that our children and grandchildren are counting on us to solve. So I know that's maybe too broad for the Select Committee on Modernization, but I know it's your heart, and I know it's your Vice Chair's heart as well. Let me talk about some structural problems that I think I would hope you would consider in the course of your business. With respect to budget and appropriations, there was a joint select committee on which both you, Chairman Kilmer, and I both served. And there were a few things that came out of that I think are important for this committee, again, to consider. I think everybody would agree that for Congress not to pass a budget and full appropriations in regular order in the last 20-plus years, and only 4 times since 1977, is pathetic. When the American people are critical of this institution and members of Congress who seemingly play by a different set of rules, this is a great case in point. Families, businesses of all size, state and local governments all have to develop a budget and live by that budget. Almost every enterprise and entity that exists in society except the federal government. And so we have to take a look in the mirror, and we have to look under the hood at some of the structural problems that allow us to continue to operate so dysfunctionally with respect to budget and appropriations. There are several here. Let me start with the one that, to me, would be the easiest to get through on a bipartisan basis, and that is no budget, no recess. So we clearly don't have the incentives aligned for us to work until we get our job done. And I think it is embarrassing for me as a member, and I think it's an audacious proposition when you're a constituent that we could actually leave town and go home on recess not having our work done. And we do it all the time. So it seems to me a very simple but effective recommendation to have greater incentive to stay here and do our job by saying, if you don't get your job done, you can't go home. So that is something I hope you will look at and consider in making Congress work better. Another one that stands out to me is the authorization process, which, Mr. Chairman, as you know, is very important because authorizing committees have to look at programs. They have to ask tough questions and determine whether or not those programs are working to meet their intended goals and their desired outcomes. And if they're not, then they need to make the appropriate changes. There is over $712 billion in unauthorized appropriations for fiscal year 2018, spanning 30 laws and 11 authorizing committees. So we have to put, again, incentives in place whereby you're penalized as an authorizing committee if you, in fact, authorize or you get appropriations to programs and to laws where you haven't done your due diligence, you haven't done your oversight. I know my time is running out. Please consider these structural changes to the budget and appropriations process so we can live by the same rules that the American people do, and most importantly, so we can have a good outcome for the sake of the people we represent. So thanks for your time.
Mr. Pasquarello, I'm going to recognize Mr. Davis. I know he had a brief statement as well. I may move you into the on-deck circle because of this, but I'll defer to Mr. Davis first. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you to Chairman Kilmer. It's always good to be placed in the queue ahead of my good friend, Mr. Pasquarello. I will not ask for the president's tax returns today, but I bet you will. Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I do want to thank Chairman Kilmer and Vice Chairman Graves, and also the many folks, including Mr. Pasquarello, who are coming in today. A lot of great ideas already today. I really appreciate being on this committee with the group of individuals we've been blessed with serving with, and I think this committee can actually work together to get things done and implement some of the provisions that are being recommended to us. I have a unique perspective being a staffer for 16 years for one of our colleagues, Mr. Shimkus, prior to becoming a member. And I know firsthand how frustrating some of the processes can be as a staffer, working through the many issues that we face on a daily basis, making sure the offices function in a better way. Furthermore, as a member of the Committee on House Administration for the last several Congresses, and now as a ranking member of the committee, I've spent significant time in these issue areas. I want to highlight a few areas that I hope this committee makes recommendations as part of its work. We need to allow the House to run more like a business and less like a government bureaucracy. We ought to leverage the purchasing power of all offices for things like commodity IT equipment. This would save money, and some standardization would improve our cybersecurity that Ms. Eshoo just so eloquently outlined. We need to find ways for the House to be more innovative on the technology front, not trying to do everything in-house, but rather streamline the approval process for third-party vendors that offer solutions that offices can take advantage of. One example is we now have a pilot program for a third constituent management system that would be more cloud-based and more updated to what the private sector is using versus
somewhat of the duopoly that we've created in our offices with 2 CMS systems now. We need to improve the process of governing shared employees. Offices have these positions now because they're not getting the level of service they expect from the institutional support offices, such as the finance office or HIR. Technology assessment services available to members of Congress so that we get members to get smart on technology issues in order to make informed policy decisions too. That's something we ought to work on. Finally, a few thoughts on the jurisdiction of franking operations ought to be included in this committee's jurisdiction too. My former co-chair of the Franking Commission, Ms. Susan Davis, talked about some of the issues she's going to update the Franking Commission with and update the House operations with. And I support many of those, and Susan and I worked together last Congress to actually achieve some bipartisan reforms. We revised the advertisement regulations so members are better able to take advantage of social media ads. We rolled out a system for the online submission of franking requests, which saved staff time and eliminated the need for physical paperwork. So those steps were done. I look forward to working with Ms. Davis and the committee to do more. Again, as she said, the committee was created in the 1970s, and obviously digital communication back then was not something we envisioned, so we need to do more. The largest opportunity for improvement, I believe, is in how digital communications are handled. It's an environment where communications occur at the speed of a tweet, and the commission still operates in business days, so it's clear that there's room to speed up the processes for approving digital ads, make updates to the outdated statute that don't mention our digital technologies of today, and we need to work together to develop clear and deliberate policies, processes, and enforcement mechanisms for members who don't follow the rules but use the digital platform. So with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Pascarell, thank you for your nimbleness. We're trying to defer to our leaders as they come in and out. They're now out, so that means you're up. So thank you all. Defer to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, and I'm interested in what Mr. Davis had to say and what he always has to say, because I believe this is one of the buried problems here. We never address it. Very seldom do we address it, and yet it is in charge of what we do every day, what we can get to, what references we have, what resources we have. If we don't have those resources, then we cannot do our job. There's no two ways about it. So Chairman Kilmer and Ranking Member Graves, thank you for having me testify this morning. I'm in 2 other hearings right now. I'm glad I made it on time. I'm delighted to participate in this critical process to make Congress work again. For the last 25 years, we have watched, as our Congress, the Article 1 branch, and we are the Article 1 branch. Go back to your history. There was a reason for making us Article 1. Article 1 branch has become more and more feeble. This decay is from deliberate institutional vandalism. Through our own efforts, we have made Article 1 branch into the 3rd branch. Our streams of independent information have been cut off, leaving each of us reliant on and subservient to the executive branch and flotillas of corporate lobbyists, neither of which have the best interests of the people's Congress or sometimes the people themselves at heart. Our investigatory muscles are atrophied, as our committees have been stripped of their ability to develop policy through analysis and debate. Instead, we have shifted funding to the leadership, leaving the legislative process solely in their hands. Our tiny staffs are overwhelmed by the army of corporate lobbyists roaming our halls in a world growing more socially and economically and technologically complex at a stunning rate. Think about this. Each of us represents about 750,000 American people, armed with small policy staffs managing portfolios of hundreds of issues. This is the product of fiendish cuts
set in 1995. We can almost direct ourselves and bring our attention to that year, that famous, I would say infamous year of 1995. We have inexplicably never bothered to reverse what happened then. We don't need a brain surgeon to tell us what needs to be done to fix this decay. Actually, we might, because we need a new brain. We need to reverse the congressional lobotomy that began in 1995. We need empowered chairmen and women who can assemble legislation organically. We need to retain skilled staffs who can preserve institutional memory, critical to what we do every day. We need committees to be laboratories of democracy once more. That goes for Democrats and Republicans. To start, we should refund the Office of Technology Assessment, the OTA. In a world of artificial intelligence, biomedical research, self-driving cars, cybersecurity, and of course climate change, we need the best information at our fingertips. But we've been here too long to beat around the bush. Ultimately, nearly all our problems come back to staggering underinvestment in ourselves. We did this to ourselves. We had no one else to blame. We need to drastically reform members' representational allowances to keep staff in the first place. Staff should not be enticed to leave for lobbyist pay, taking their expertise with them. We lose when that happens. The MRA is used first for salaries, second for member travel, and third for office supplies. New technology and members' travel should not impact an office's ability to offer competitive salaries to retain staff. We need to decouple these funds, find ways to remove the politics from salary increases and benefits, such as student loans and parental vacation and sick leave. We need to allocate more for our research arms. CRS, I could spend the next 2 hours talking about it. GAO, CBO, and the OTA. Remember, the Iran-Contra research was done by the GAO. The Watergate came out of the Congress in its own doings, across the board. No tinkering at the edges, and we need to think big more. Can I have one more minute? Is that possible?
The speaker's in the on-deck circle, and I want to just respect her time.
I will close.
If that's all right. Honestly, I think that was a good call.
Is that diplomatic?
Yeah.
So you get what you pay for. If you care about Congress, the first branch, Article 1 branch, then the preeminent branch you support. You support it that way. And my fellow members, good brothers and sisters, I ask you if you got a chance to read. I was asked to write it. I didn't think of it myself. I was asked to write it by the Post. I don't know if we have copies for you as well. I hope all the members have it. And I laid out basically, I didn't choose the title of the article. Congress, why is Congress so dumb? That was not my doing. I would have chosen something more radical. But I leave it to you. I'm available later on or anything for questions, and I appreciate the fact you allowed me to come and testify.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your leadership on this issue, and we'll make sure everyone has a copy of your terrific editorial. And with that, let me invite up our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi from the state of California. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record.
Thank you very much,
Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, and
Thank
may I thank you and Mr. Graves for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you. And let me call to everyone to join our colleague, Mr. Pascrell, in calling attention to his op-ed, which I recommend to everyone to read because it, in some length and depth, goes into how we should go forward. Thank you for your service on this committee and your leadership in this Congress. I do believe that as an institution that's been around for over 200 years or more than, well over 200 years, that we should always be subjecting how we function to some scrutiny and some shedding light on how we can do things in a better way. I think in doing so, we have to remember that we are the people's house and that we want the people to know what happens here. And that is why my approach to all of this in my opening day comments was to say that we want a Congress that is more transparent, more open in terms of people having notice of what is happening here so that they can weigh in on the decisions of the House of Representatives. I consider the sessions of Congress to be a national town hall meeting, the people's house, transparent, and again, striving for bipartisanship. We have a responsibility to find our common ground where we can, so to strive for that bipartisanship wherever possible, and to do so in a way that is unifying for America. That is a responsibility we have to come here, certainly to share our different views because our job title and our job description are one and the same, representative, but also nonetheless to say, as we prioritize our actions, where is it that we have the most common ground to unify? Our founders were generous in their Constitution in making the the Congress of the United States the first branch of government, right after the beautiful preamble of our purpose, Article 1, the legislative branch, and that within that, the House of Representatives, the people's house. It's pretty exciting. I say as Speaker of the House and want to serve as leader, whip, and all the rest. Ever honored by any title or job responsibility our colleagues give us, nothing is more important than the job that our constituents give to us, to speak for them, to represent them in the Congress of the United States, the people's house. So I wish you well in your work, and I'll just say that to be representative, one of the, I'm going to submit my statement for the record, but I do talk about it being family-friendly, talking about what we did before our Women's Economic Agenda when we had the majority before, continuing that with our diversity initiative, which we had then, but which now we are making more official, to establishing a diversity and inclusion office to expand paid internships so that kids who cannot afford to come because it's not a paid internship will be able to come, and that broadens the universe of people who can come. And again, a call for leadership development initiatives. Many state legislatures have such an initiative. We should have one here too, and I think that that is a charge that your committee has. So I look forward to how you hear from members about how they would like to see that leadership development take place. Again, we're reviewing the services of the House Family Room and conferring with women's members to assess services in the Women's Lounge, more responsive to our constituents, working with the Committee on House Administration to seek to task House officers to develop a district office support system, because that is our job. Representative job description, representative job title, and included in that is that we meet the needs of our constituents. This is the work of this committee I respect. I think it will be vital in coordinating, supporting some of these initiatives that you are discussing. And together, I think working together, and I emphasize this, and some people have talked about changing MTR, this or that. I am a big respecter of the rights of the minority in the Congress of the United States, and I believe as Speaker of the whole House that the initiatives that you put forth are those for the whole House, whether it's development of leadership, inclusion, both women, minorities, et cetera, people of color, gender identity, and the rest, that our people's house looks like the American people when people see our presentations on TV. And again, social media gives you so much opportunity, you who have this responsibility now, because the communication with with and the American people in real time is a real possibility. I'll just close by saying, if you haven't done so, and I'm sure most of you have, but for those in the room who may not have, if you go to the Library of Congress and go to the Jefferson Room and look up some of our early documents, our sacred documents of our founders, say the Declaration of Independence or other, even some of the provenance in the House of Burgesses and the rest of that. But look at the Declaration of Independence, and you can see right there how it was and how it was changed by suggestions and all the rest. And I think that that would be an important model for how we show the public, this is what the law is now, this is what this law that is being proposed would change that, but they could just call it up themselves. They just call it up themselves. It's a remarkable, remarkable technology that is available there, and there's no reason why every person in America can't know how laws, what the law is, how this would change it. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What other changes would you make? Because again, we are their representatives and we want to know their thinking so that we can speak for them in the Congress. So I'm excited about this. Obviously, we established it. I have faith in what you do. I believe the solutions that you come up with have to have strong bipartisanship, and that is, again, transparency, bipartisanship, e pluribus unum from anyone. They could never imagine how many we would be. They could never imagine how different we might be from each other. But they knew that we had to remember that we are one nation, under God, indivisible. So that should be a responsibility we carry as we debate our priorities in the Congress of the United States. So I thank you for executing your patriotic duty to weigh in on the first article of the Constitution, Article 1, the legislative branch, in our case, the People's House. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership, Mr. Graves, as Vice Chair for yours, and each and every one of you for your service in the Congress and on this important select committee.
Thanks so much.
Thank
you
you.
for your good words, and thanks for submitting the written testimony, and thank you for your leadership in establishing this committee.
Thank you, I appreciate that. No questions? I like it like that. Thank you all.
Invite up Leader McCarthy, Mr. Mast, and Leader Fitzpatrick. Thank you for your patience.
First of all, I want to thank the Speaker for creating this select committee. Part of me is a little jealous that we didn't do it when we were in the majority. But I hope you all take it in the sense of what this committee has created and why. Because I take it very serious. I was able to make appointments, but to Mr. Kilmer and Mr. Graves, there's only one other committee in Congress that's equally numbered, and that's the Ethics Committee. What you have before you now is a window and an opportunity. You have a set date when you have to be done by, but I think you have a very willing Congress on both sides of the aisle that would like to see Congress take the traditions of the past but apply it to a changing future. We all understand that Congress is by the people and for the people, but I believe our Congress should be effective, efficient, and held accountable. And there's many ways to do that. Structure dictates behavior. And there's a few things I want to point out that I know you'll look at rules from Approps and others, but I want you to put in your mind something even different. There's a few things we did in the last Congress that wasn't partisan in any way. I created something called the Innovation Initiative, and every bill we put through would get about 300, and I think it averaged 372 votes. We didn't start out to write something bipartisan, but what it dealt with was how to make Congress more efficient, but use technology to do it. And I want to point a few of those out for you. One is the very first bill that was signed in the last Congress, mine called the Talent Act. If we really want to get fundamental change here and utilize technology, we may need help from the outside. Think of the Peace Corps, but think of it in a manner of some of the brightest minds around the world in technology companies that want to give back to their country, not create a new occupation, but maybe spend 2 or 3 years in our agencies and others. Because the one thing we understand is how you analyze data could help you improve your customer service, could make you more efficient, and can hold you more accountable to where you're weak in that. And I think bringing some fresh eyes in, we have this program now. Then I want you to also think we created something called the bug bounty. Technology continues to change our life, but where are there weaknesses in our technology? So what we did, we created a bug bounty for DHS where we invited the public in, and they would sit there and work through it and show us where there were problems. And the one thing that you get there, cost efficiency, but they get a reward in the basis of what they find, but you get the public getting more ownership of their own government and helping in that process. Created something, passed a bill called Vet Tech. There's new ways of education out there, like Udacity. I don't know if any of you have heard of Udacity. Udacity was created by Sebastian Thurn. And what he did was, he made a college program that was shorter, and you'd go to work at these technology companies. Some of it would be online and others. But our own veterans were not allowed to be a part of it. So as technology continues to change our life, let's make sure Congress has the same ability to do it. And this is one prime example, and I give another Graves credit for this. This is Garrett Graves came to me. We all have this in dealing with our constituents. A constituent calls us, and they have a real need, but a timely need. And we simply say, well, can you come into the office and sign a release of information, or let me mail it to you. You put it and you mail it back. But at the same time we're saying that, a UPS driver pulls up and we just sign digitally accepting of that package. So we engaged government, and you may not know this, but there is a private program going on right now in a number of our Republican and Democrat offices that use this digitally, a release of information form. So they can send us the information. We could be faster in our service, but think about how that would go with everywhere else and provide that data as we move through. So what I'm looking for is building greater confidence in the institution that we have, utilizing the 21st century technology to make us more customer friendly, give us more accountability, but at the same time will give us greater information that can hold us accountable in this process. One other thing I'd like you to look at, in utilizing, one thing that Steny Hoyer and I have done together, we utilize a digital service where we have a hackathon, where we invite all these hackers in for 2 days, and we let all these different parts of the government finding ways that we can do it better. And it grows every year, and the public gets very excited about it, and it saves us a great deal amount of money. Now, other things you want to see is, as the 21st century comes on us and we move more towards technology, are we secure? Blockchain is changing and revolutionizing the security of the financial industry out there. Why would we wait around, and why wouldn't we institute blockchain in our own to be able to check the technologies, but also the transparency of our own legislative documents? And why can't we use the basic skill of a Microsoft program that when we change bills, any alteration, you see the red mark through, you see where the change has come, and it's instantaneous. That's not a partisan issue. It helps on all sides. So personally, I hope you take the job that you're on very serious, because I'm going to take your recommendations in a very serious level. And I'm hopeful and I'm thankful that so many are turning out, that we have an opportunity to take this window, not on a partisan basis, but you could actually help reframe to the 21st century the ability to make this place more effective, more efficient, and most importantly, more accountable. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony and for your leadership on these issues. And Mr. Mass, thank you for your patience. Let me invite you up. We've got Brian Mast from the state of Florida, and without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
I would start by saying the most important lesson that I learned about leadership was during my time in the military, and it's that you never ask your men to do something that you wouldn't be willing to do yourself, you hadn't already done yourself. Now, I do thank you, Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, for holding this hearing today to speak about something that has literally concerned me since the moment that I walked through these doors. When I was sworn in as a member of Congress in January 2017, I did step into a new role where access to our nation's most sensitive information is simply automatically granted. Let me say this as pointedly as possible. Being elected in a political process is not in any way, shape, or form the same as being investigated to ensure trustworthiness to keep and handle state secrets. We as representatives undergo no vetting in advance of classified briefings, and we do not get debriefed after receiving classified information. There is a shocking lack of procedure in our institutions' access or requirement to access information to earn a special trust that should be required for viewing sensitive information. Per House rules, representatives are entitled to such information as is necessary to perform their job and represent the interests of their constituents, but many times that information, it includes sensitive details about America's policies and programs that, if revealed to the public, it would jeopardize national security of the United States, operational security of ongoing missions, reveal U.S. strategy in dealing with foreign countries. Now, I don't want to glaze over the national security implications lightly. Some of the information that representatives and senators are privy to would collapse whole intelligence networks. It would dramatically alter international diplomacy, shift global economic markets, compel new wars, put U.S. security or U.S. assets at risk by revealing sources if that information were known by our enemies. American lives have too often been lost because of unauthorized and illegal breaches of security information. That's why we evolved procedures over the breadth of our nation's existence to properly investigate the men and women who are worthy of that special trust, to require them to become stewards of our nation's secrets. Now, prior to being elected as a member of Congress, I was a part of that small subsect of Americans trusted with classified information, holding clearances from Department of Energy Q clearance to TS, SCI clearance, countless read-ons to different programs. The process to do that, it's long, and the investigatives, they're invasive in order to earn that trust. They include investigators meeting with people from every place that you've lived, every place that you've worked, every place that you've gone to school. They can include polygraphs, they can include lifestyle examinations, financial reviews, and all of this is redone every few years to make sure that you haven't got yourself into a situation that could make you at risk. Now, by the time that I had earned that trust and that access to classified information, the potential consequences of a breach of my responsibility, they were evident to me, they were deeply personal to me, and this is something that I think we should all be aware of. It was made abundantly clear to me that in the event that I leaked any sensitive information, I would lose my access to classified information, I would probably be subject to prosecution, and I may in fact be imprisoned. Access that is casually bestowed is never going to be respected. I believe that after being elected as members of Congress, we should be vetted like other government officials, and I'm going to speak about a knife that cuts both ways. Do we have members with lifestyle choices that make them targets for blackmail? Do we have members with contra-American views? Do we have members who simply don't care if they share info labeled FOUO or TSSCI? Do we have representatives that hate Israel so much they would share classified information to hurt them? Do we have representatives who will share information with their staff who may have no clearances? Do we have representatives who are sympathetic to terrorist groups such as the Palestinian Authority or would disclose information to individuals like Abbas? Do we have representatives who are sympathetic to socialist ideals such as those that would share sensitive information with like-minded leaders like Maduro? Do we have representatives with knowledge of national security secrets that may inadvertently be disclosed on U.S. operations to states like Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China? Do we have representatives who share classified information with the ranks of reporters who wait directly outside our classified briefings to ask about what we were told? These are all questions that should be answered in order for us to responsibly be purveyors of our national security information. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
With that, let me invite up Brian Fitzpatrick from the state of Pennsylvania. Thank you for your patience as we had the speaker and the leader come in. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. And Mr. Fitzpatrick, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves. Two good men to be leaving this very important committee. My statement's going to be entered into the record, so I need not read it verbatim. I'm going to go off script a little bit here. I think one of the things that I was very happy to see this committee be formed in order to address some of these challenges, I think all of us know, no matter when we got here, two things. Number one, this institution is certainly broken, and number two, there's a lot of changes that we can make. And there's a lot of areas we can discuss. My friend and colleague, Mr. Mass, addressed one very important one. But I just want to share with you a story. My first day, we got sworn in 2 years ago, going up to the elevator and seeing a sign that says members only. And I was with a constituent of mine. And I thought something when I saw that. What I thought internally, I didn't say it, was there's only two places that I've ever seen members only signs. Exclusive golf country clubs and the House of Representatives. And the constituent said to me, I didn't say a word to her, she looked at it and she said, Brian, this is Exhibit A of what's wrong with this place. Why don't the signs say citizens only? Why aren't we forced to take the stairs or accommodate our constituents? If this is the people's house, why are we viewing ourselves as a special class of human being? It gets into a broader legislative issue. You hear a lot of talk about passing legislation. I certainly have a piece of this as well, but a number of my colleagues have introduced it. That all laws that are passed apply equally to its members of Congress. Why is that not the case? If we're requiring presidential tax returns to be disclosed, which they should be, why not have every member of Congress disclose their tax returns? Why do we apply some rules that apply to some people and not others? Chairman Kilmer, as you know, I'm the vice chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus. One of the things that we worked on significantly last year was a break the gridlock package. To the credit of House leadership, many of those provisions were included in this rules package. It's one of the reasons why I voted for that rules package. First time that someone's crossed party lines to vote for a rules package in probably 2 decades, because we put a lot of work into that rules package. We would like to see the remainder of it implemented. And I want to give you one very, very important example. There are 435 members of this House. One of the things that we advanced was that each member, and the form can take whatever form it needs to take for this to function and to work. Every single one of us represents roughly 725,000 people, all of whom have their voice through their representative, and yet all 435 members of this House are not actively and equally involved in the legislative process. One of the things we try to advance was that every single member of Congress be allowed to identify at a minimum one district priority where they're entitled to a full committee markup on their committee of jurisdiction, because we would like to think that members of Congress are going to seek out assignments to committees that benefit their home districts, and they are able to get at least one bipartisan co-sponsor. Allow that to proceed with a full committee markup. And then as far as full floor votes, I'm sure we've all experienced pieces of legislation that only need 218 votes to pass, yet some pieces of legislation have over 300 co-sponsors and cannot see the light of day on the floor of the House of Representatives. Good luck trying to explain that to the people we represent back home. There's a lot of things that have perpetuated in the system for a long time that make no sense to people outside of the bubble here in D.C., and I think that if that ought to be our litmus test. I've entered into the record the entire statement. Most of it pertains to the Break the Gridlock package that myself and Josh Gottheimer and Tom Reed and Tom Swazi put a lot of work into building up. They are our suggestions for how to make this place work again, and we appreciate the consideration of this committee. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman. I had a little bit more prosaic concern. I was thinking what was the worst waste of time I have when I'm in Congress. And I think most of us would recognize that as travel time. Time in airplanes, time in airports. I jotted these notes while I was waiting for an incredibly late airplane. in Atlanta again, and I thought I'd share some ideas of how we might affect the travel time and benefit us all with more time to spend. Historically, members spent more time in Washington and more time with each other. I think the senior members of the Congress would relate to you the time that they spent socializing both within the party and across the aisle, helped them get along and helped them build a more bipartisan attitude towards governing. And it's harder to hate people when you're up close to them. The changes were made when Speaker Gingrich came in 95, and he wanted everybody to go back and spend more time at home and get closer to their district, get better known there. I would maintain, and I've had one of my stalwart interns go back and look at the days at home, and I would say that we are not spending any more time at home than we used to spend. And in fact, we're just spending more time traveling. I propose that we give back some of that time, basically cut the travel time and give that time back. And we can give it back to ourselves where we think we need it, whether it's in Washington, as it might be in the first year of a session, or back in the district when you're campaigning in the off years. The calendars that I will submit separately to you respect all of the holidays, Christian, Jewish, federal, Father's Day, Mother's Day, everything gets respected there. And I want to reflect on some of the potential benefits that would then inure to all of us. We'd have more productive work weeks in Washington, longer periods of time consecutively at home and up here, stronger social ties among the members, and I think we would recognize substantial savings in terms of money as well as time. And so this is just an idea for how we condense the time here and condense the time back at home, and you can shift it either way you want. This is a very malleable schedule, and I'll submit the calendars for the record. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mr. Dunn. Appreciate your testimony. Thank you. Pretty sure I broke the clock. All right, we got it working again. Thank you. With that, let me invite up Jack Bergman from the state of Michigan. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Mr. Bergman, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Thanks.
Good morning, and thank you, members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify before you today on the subject of the modernization of the United States Congress. Having just begun my second term as a member of Congress, I'd like to offer the committee my opinion of what I believe modernization should truly encompass and what it really should look like in the end. I applaud the House and the members of this committee who are here to look for ways to make Congress a more effective, functional legislative body. But as I look at the list of areas we have tasked you to focus on, i.e. policies to develop the next generation of leaders, technology and innovation, and rules to promote a more modern and efficient Congress, I must say these are all very commendable goals and should be looked at. However, I believe that only focusing on the inner workings of Congress just addresses symptoms of our dysfunction and not the real source or root causes of the problem. If we are truly to fix some of our deep-rooted, significant institutional problems, we must look at the vision of our founding fathers and the document that we all hold dear in carrying out our oaths of office, the Constitution. Twice in our country's history, we have amended the Constitution to reflect necessary change in our elected leadership. The first, via the 17th Amendment in 1913, we changed the election of senators from being elected by their state legislatures to election by the popular vote. The second, via the 22nd Amendment in 1951, we limited the term of the President of the United States to 2 terms. But it should be noted that we have never, in the history of our country, changed, modified, or amended the Constitution in a way on how we elect our members of the House of Representatives. I believe we now have that opportunity while we attempt to modernize Congress, to look at the realities of what it takes to be an effective member of the House of Representatives in the 21st century, in the digital age, and to enable us to function in such a way that we are serving our constituents in the absolute best way possible. I believe the time is now to start the conversation about changing via an amendment to the Constitution how we elect our U.S. representatives. While there are many options available, I firmly believe that, number one, changing the term of office from 2 years to 4 years is paramount. And number two, limiting the number of terms that a representative can serve to 5 consecutive terms will yield the most effective long-term results while maintaining our founders' vision. With those changes, it will enable our representatives to better serve the American people, the country, and to continue the vision of our founders that have enabled us to live in a free society governed by the people and for the people. Modernization must be more than addressing the inner workings and the administrative functions of Congress. Again, let's deal with root causes of a 21st century based upon the framework we have been given. The task laid out to this select committee is a formidable one, and I appreciate the committee's time and attention, and also, as much as a Marine never wants to volunteer for anything, I will volunteer to put as much blood, sweat, and tears along with my colleagues to look at this, because we are here for the long term, and I am proud to be a member of the 116th Congress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bergman. Appreciate your testimony. We've got a brief break in members coming in to testify, so we'll go at ease for 5 minutes, and we'll be back in action in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good, because I got to get back to committee.
And this thing I added the paragraph, bottom of page 3 that you asked for. Hey. Sorry. Text him now.
One, even breakdown, I don't know if I like that change, but
So Woodall doesn't get to ask me 1,000 questions? Hey, Rob, look at him, he's so intense. Forget it, he's like intense. Don't mess with me. Do not mess with me. I know.
I wouldn't go on and on. Takes one to know one, buddy. do people live in their offices? I urge the committee to find a solution to this issue as well. And with that, I yield back to the chair, and I thank you all for your consideration of these points.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
And for your patience as well. With that, let me invite up John Sarbanes from the state of Maryland. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. And you're now recognized for, I'm sure that wasn't intended as a slight. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Sorry, I appreciate the work of the committee. I don't think there's any more important charge than the one that you have to figure out how we can modernize Congress, respond to the needs of our members, and obviously serve the public more effectively. As you know, I've been very focused on the impact that money is having on our politics, on governing, on the way we make policy up here. And we've seen that impact on the political system in a lot of different ways, there's no question. I want to talk today about how that has affected the capacity of Congress to function well and what this committee can do about it, because I do think you have a role to play in addressing this problem. We know the cost of campaigns has been going up exponentially over the last few years. I think the average cost of a winning congressional campaign now is $1.6 million. What has happened is that there's a whole kind of ecosystem of influencers out there that have built an infrastructure to respond to the needs that members have to raise that kind of money. So what you see is corporations, outside interest groups, trade associations pouring billions of dollars into this very sophisticated ecosystem of influence, which is designed to win the hearts and minds of policymakers, their staff, eager to fill the void that's created by the demands of modern campaign fundraising and so forth. So essentially what happens is those influencers seeking a return on the investment. I don't blame them. I mean, that's how the human mind works. You know, if you invest in something, you want to get something for it. But what's happened is at the same time, the appetite of those folks has increased to get kind of that return on investment. We've been cutting our own capacity in ways that are really alarming. So look at the cuts to resources that we have for the experts that we rely on, the Congressional Research Service, the now moribund Office of Technology Assessment is an example, again, of cutting our own capacity, our ability to assemble expertise. Low pay, long hours for our staff have led to increased turnover, degraded institutional memory, weakened our basic capacity, which only further empowers these outside interests to kind of fill the vacuum. Scholars have called this, they've come up with the phrase legislative subsidy. And Lee Drutman at the New America Foundation has talked about this, writing in the Washington Post, quote, "In many cases, corporate lobbyists also serve as external support staff to help congressional staffers do their jobs, providing what has been called a legislative subsidy. Lobbyists give aides new policy ideas that they can take to their bosses, and they're only too happy to draft legislation for them. Drafting legislation, after all, is hard work. It requires a level of legal knowledge and precision that can take years to acquire. Consider the great Cromnibus of 2014, which included a provision that weakened some of the Dodd-Frank financial regulations. As was widely reported at the time, Citigroup lobbyists wrote most of the legislative language in that provision. That shouldn't be okay from our standpoint. But since only members of Congress can introduce legislation, Kevin Yoder, who was here at that time, put his name on the original standalone bill that got folded into the Cromnibus. Looking at the numbers drives this capacity issue home. In 2010, the House spent $1.37 billion. It was estimated to have employed between 7,000 and 8,000 staffers. Compare that to corporations and special interests who burned through twice as much, $2.6 billion on lobbying, and were estimated to employ 12,000 federally registered lobbyists. And these numbers have only grown more out of whack in recent years, given the additional budget cuts and the growing K Street ranks. So to put this simply, when Congress puts its own abilities, or rather guts its own abilities and is distracted by other demands, fundraising and other things, third parties are going to fill in the role. And those third parties, no matter what you think of them, are not working for the public interest all the time. They're working for their own interest. I get that. I understand that. They should be working for their own interest. The question is, are we working for our interests and for the broader public interest? And we need to make sure our capacity is strong in order to do that. We should not willfully surrender the public interest to some other interest, because then the public will suffer. So as you do your work, I certainly urge every member here to think about this dynamic that I'm talking about and engage honestly with the reality that we have voluntarily weakened our own capacity to govern. Our job is to serve the public interest, and when we surrender our capacity, we fail to do our jobs to the fullest. Thanks very much for the opportunity to testify, and I wish you Godspeed in this work. Very, very important. Thank you. Yield back.
Member for having this hearing, and I want to just let the chairman know I hope that the work that we did together on the Rebuild Congress initiative and the Reformers Caucus had some influence and hopefully is helpful. There are several things that I guess first, when I got here, I thought this place was insane. I really did. I was a prosecutor for 25 years, and I get here, and there are so many things that we do that are so offensive to the American public. They know something's wrong, but they don't know the details of what's wrong. And one of those that has been highlighted for me is in order to be a chair of a committee or to serve on an A committee, the amount of money that a member raises for the party is taken into account. And it appears to be, to the public, a pay-for-play proposition. It appears that people are buying committee chairmanships and people are buying committee positions. And it is fundamentally wrong. It's a wrong appearance, and it's wrong in fact. I've sent a letter to the Ethics Committee asking for that practice to be ruled unethical. I have not received any answer from the Ethics Committee, and I hope this committee takes up that idea. Nothing wrong with raising money for the party, but it shouldn't be tied directly to a seat on a committee or a senior leadership position on a committee. And so that to me is just offensive behavior. But beyond that, there is such a, they say, one of the things I heard when I first got here was that nothing moves legislation like the smell of jet fuel. We make such a rush to get to the airport, to get back to our districts, to do a lot of meetings in our districts, that we don't build the relationships that we need to build in this town to actually move legislation. I think a lot of this job involves building relationships, and we don't have the time to build those relationships. And it's a mistake, I believe, to not have a 5-day work week, not vote on a Friday night and again on a Monday morning to force people to stay in the district, schedule some type of event on a Saturday so that members interact more and get to know each other. We have so many new members, it seems, every Congress that it is, in my view, very important that it's hard to call someone a bad name. I won't use any examples here, but it's hard to call someone a bad name if you know them, if you know their spouse, if you know their kids, if your families are friends. And I think that existed 20, 30, 40 years ago and before, but it doesn't exist now. And the civility, I believe, in this body and the bipartisanship in this body and the ability to move good legislation would be improved if we had more interaction. The last thing I want to mention is we have a rule that we cannot fund unauthorized programs. My big issue is the deficit and the debt. We have a rule that we can't fund unauthorized programs. The authorizing committees don't authorize programs, often because they are politically dicey, and as a result, when the appropriations bill comes before the Rules Committee, in the rules, in the rule for that appropriations bill, there is a waiver for the rule that we passed at the beginning of Congress saying we shouldn't appropriate to unauthorized programs. I think it's really important that we do our job of oversight, that we do the very best we can to make sure we understand the programs that we're funding, and I think that we would be able to reduce the debt if, in fact, agencies knew that we were looking. And so those are my 3 suggestions.
Thank you, Mr. Buck. Appreciate your testimony. And with that, the committee will now welcome the testimony of Congresswoman Katie Porter from the state of California. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Congresswoman Porter, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chair, Mr. Graves, and members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to testify. I'm eager to see the work of this new Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. As a part of a historic freshman class, I want to help guide this institution to better serve the American people. And I have a great appreciation for the traditions that shape Congress. Processes and customs crafted over centuries of careful debate are important for the stability and continuity of our Congress. At the same time, Congress must adapt to effectively do its work. If we modernize how Congress functions, opportunities will expand for more people to serve. And those who serve can do a better job for the people. I'm organizing my testimony into 4 points today, but with one guiding theme. Congress is not built for the middle class. I encountered this problem head-on while trying to represent people of my district. Our constituents deserve an accessible district office where they can feel welcome, have their voices heard, and talk with me and my staff about the problems they're facing. As I worked to secure a lease, most landlords, very understandably, wanted a security deposit before they would rent to me. But puzzlingly, that security deposit couldn't be paid with congressional funds. It had to come out of the member's personal bank account. Like millions of Americans, writing a check for $5,000 or more caused me a lot of stress. If I didn't have the money sitting around, and I didn't, would it mean the 45th District would go without the office they deserved? That didn't seem fair to my constituents. I ultimately found a landlord that did not require a security deposit, but my constituents were deprived of a district office for weeks because of the presumption that newly elected members have significant personal financial resources. Even in my orientation, I confronted the bias against members without significant financial resources. At my orientation, Human Resources told me that even though I'd take the oath of office on January 3rd, my health insurance wouldn't start until February 1st. This left me panicking. Would my 3 kids have to go without medical coverage for a whole month? What if one of them got sick or had an emergency? When I raised this issue with HR and asked how other members navigated this, they told me to go on my husband's insurance or to buy COBRA. First, I don't have a husband. I'm a single mom. And second, I had not planned to have a lapse in insurance and therefore confronted very high COBRA premiums. Again, I was ultimately able to solve this problem by working with my former employer, but other members may not be as fortunate and could go uninsured while serving in the U.S. Congress. This is unacceptable. Congress also isn't built for the middle class when it comes to hearing the voices of everyday Americans. The House rules silence those who cannot afford to travel to Washington, D.C. on their personal resources to appear before us. Our hearings are impoverished of the diverse set of experiences of the people as a result. We have an echo chamber of D.C. insiders and those with significant resources to fly across the country at the last minute. People from California and from rural areas all over the country that have high travel costs could likely never make it out of D.C. to speak to this Congress unless they are rich. This helps special interests and hurts ordinary people with important stories to tell and information to share. This is another area I hope the Select Committee will consider. Also, Congress could better promote rules that allow young staff from working families to serve. The paid internships authorized by the House are a good start, but not enough. As someone that taught at and now is fortunate enough to represent a university where 50% of the bachelor's degrees are awarded to first-generation college students, I know how early experiences like getting that diploma or finding a key internship or finding that first job can help shape a lifetime of professional opportunity. This body should help amplify the talents of ambitious young people, particularly those whose voices have not traditionally been heard. I want to add that you know the resources for internships. We have not yet been given guidance on how to use them, and it is the very students who can least afford to wait until April or May or June to get offered a last-minute internship who are being deprived of the opportunity to serve. We need to make those internship resources available early so that students who need that job to meet their financial aid obligations have the ability to come before this body. Thank you again to the chairman and members of the committee for allowing me to testify today and for your hard work. I stand ready to provide my input and voice so that we can better serve the American people and hear their voices. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. And with that, the committee now welcomes Jim Costa from the state of California. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, and you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the committee. Having been a part of an effort over the last several years with the problem solvers to look at reforms of the House, I'm pleased that this Modernization Committee has been one of the outgrowths of that effort. And it seems to me that to make your efforts, our collective efforts, worthwhile, you're going to have to make some fundamental decision as to whether or not we're going to do something around the edges that may be helpful in certain ways, or whether you want to really tackle real reform that will be difficult, not only from the standpoint of our House, but it will be difficult if we are to get support with our colleagues in the Senate to make this process work. And I'm talking about issues that involve our budget process that are much more difficult based upon where we are. I've had the honor and privilege, like many of you, to serve our constituencies. I was in the state legislature in California and was president of the National Conference of State Legislatures. And so I truly believe the notion that legislatures are the laboratories of democracy. But clearly, we can determine, and certainly the American public, I think, strongly believes that this process isn't working anymore. It's broken. And there are a number of factors that have come to this place. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in the last year or the last 10 years. It's been evolving over a period of 3 or 4 decades, depending upon what point in time you want to pick. So we know our procedures are cumbersome. The tone is acrimonious. Short-term goal of scoring political points crowds out our true mission of creating long-term thoughtful policy. The intersection between good public policy and the politics, which is when we ultimately get something done, seems to be a more elusive intersection. And the American people are frustrated with so many of us, and we're frustrated. Let's be frank. I don't think any of us feel wonderful about how this process works today. Let me give you a couple suggestions. First, and I'm talking about not around the edges, but I'm talking about tackling things head on. The budget process. You know, it was formed back in the 70s, and Leon Panetta, my good friend, and a lot of other good folks, really worked very hard on it, and with the best of intentions. And I think one could make an argument for several decades it worked more or less as they hoped it would. I don't think it's working today. I mean, let's face it. In the last 8 years, or you can pick another time period, we've gone from omnibus to CR to CR to CR to government shutdown, back to omnibus. I mean, what a way to run a railroad, let alone our nation's government. It's been years since we've processed our budget and appropriations in regular order. Beyond being ineffective, our budget process is also leading us down a very dangerous path of increased deficits and exploding debt. Our budget should reflect national priorities and require difficult choices. I think it's irresponsible to ever shut down government. You wouldn't do that in any business. I mean, and then still have people go to work? Give me a break. Who are we kidding ourselves? And we shouldn't be able to create programs and then not fund them. For those of us who were in state legislatures, when you carried a bill, you provided the funding for the bill. We do this process of authorization, and then later on we try to find the appropriations or the funding for it. What a disconnect. And by the way, why shouldn't the American public think that we're disingenuine? You know, you go home and say, I got this authorization, this all worked out, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. Oh, one thing, there's not money to appropriate it. And then maybe a year or 2 years later, you get part of the funding. I think we ought to take a page out of the book for those of us who served in legislatures. You carry legislation, you've got to have the money for it. And I think that would create another level of discipline in terms of our deficit issues. PAYGO helps. I'm a big supporter of PAYGO, but it isn't sufficient. It's problematic. First, we end up authorizing much more than we can afford. And then the programs are too often built without realistic budget trade-offs. And second, it creates unrealistic expectations. And our communities think we're making specific commitments to programs, yet they go unfulfilled. I've got 14 seconds left here. I got a few other things I wanted to say. Let me recommend you read a book. It's a 2.5, 3-hour book. Juliet Ephraim, Fight Club Politics. She's studied this place around here for many years, like a lot of other journalists. From 1980 to 2004, she talks about how things were and how things built up to the stage from the 80s to the 90s to 2004. It's a 2-3 hour read. It's illustrative of what's gone wrong here. But I want to urge you to continue to work, and there are some senators that are interested in changing this process, but at some time this committee is going to have to make a determination. Do you do small things around the edges? And some of the suggestions I just heard are helpful, and they would be good for our House. Or do we really want to tackle on the serious underlying causes that has created this dysfunctional and broken Congress? And I'll look toward your advice, and I would be very much willing to help you in any way possible once you make the determination as to how serious and how big of a level of reform you want to look at.
Thank you for your testimony. With that,
Thank you.
We'll now welcome the testimony of Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan from the state of Pennsylvania. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, and you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to the committee. My name is Chrissy Houlihan. I'm a first-term member from the great state of Pennsylvania, 6th Congressional District. And being a freshman has allowed me to look at the legislative procedure with very clean and fresh eyes. And there are 3 particular areas of concern that I'd like to highlight before the committee today. The first is that I and all of my classmates entered Congress in what would become the longest government shutdown in our country's history. And this shutdown began before the freshman Congress even took our oaths. And the irony was that we were sent here to restore our faith in our government and to civility and to rhetoric and allow the people to once again trust their Congress. When I went home, I was able to listen to members of my community, the Pennsylvania 6th, who were federal employees that went without pay. I listened to families who relied upon government services such as SNAP to get by. I listened to farmers and businesses who depended on government services to operate and function. And I hope it's clear to everyone here, both in Washington and around the country, that using the government shutdown and federal employees it affects as a negotiating tactic is an absolute failed policy and cannot happen again. Budgeting by crisis is an affront to our legislative processes, and in this instance, a way for the executive branch to run around Congress's power of the purse. So I and a number of my classmates introduced a bill, my first bill, H.R. 834, the Shutdown to End All Shutdowns Act, which hoped to prevent such tactics from harming the Americans, federal workers, and government contractors in the future. This bill would disincentivize shutdown as a negotiating tool by transferring the financial hardship of shutdowns to the executive branch and to members of Congress, rather than to the people whom we serve. It is critical that as a Congress, we act now and take preventative measures for the American workers never to have to endure such a shutdown again. I recognize that our idea is one of many that were put forward to make sure that shutdowns do not occur again, and if they do, that they punish the very people who made it happen. And I just don't want us to lose sight of that very painful way that I began my career, and make sure that we continue to think about modernizing Congress in this way. My second suggestion came also from a freshman experience. I wrote and signed a letter with Representative Lori Trahan urging House leadership to reevaluate the motion to recommit and its place in the legislative process. Both Democrats and Republicans have used parliamentary procedures like the motion to recommit for far too long to derail legislation. And our job is that of governance and not of politics. I frankly saw this as well as a freshman when there was a motion to adjourn, and when 435 of us stood up from our meetings and walked over to vote to not adjourn the House. This is another really terrible way of using the time of the people to do something that's completely political. In 2018, the American people made it clear that their patience with partisan politics and business as usual in the nation's capital has been exhausted. They want Congress to get to work on the people's priorities on both sides, debating their views openly and sincerely. And as it currently stands, the MTR doesn't generate a debate over ideas that would genuinely improve the contents of the bill and it affects the American people. And that's why I, along with all my fellow freshmen, I'm asking leadership to simply work with us to re-examine these sorts of procedures and to determine a more effective path to use them. My final idea for the committee is that there needs to be more collaboration with leadership and with committees when it comes to scheduling. Why can't committee meeting times be staggered so that members who serve on multiple committees can meet their full responsibilities? Tomorrow, I am supposed to be at 2 subcommittee meetings for the same committee at the same time, and I, amongst 9 other people, are on both subcommittees at the very same time. There's no way that I can physically be there, and that's only one of my committees. There are times when members have 2 committee meetings at the same times when votes are also happening, and we should have a much more collaborative committee work to make sure that we plan in advance on what our schedule looks like. The voting schedule itself needs far more predictability. The only time in the week when we know when we are to vote is the very first day of the week at 6:30. Of the 4 days that we're in Washington each week, there is that only one time where we know what time the vote will be in advance. Meetings with constituents are scheduled and get canceled because of votes. Classified national security briefings are interrupted because of votes. I was gavelled into a classified security briefing, votes were called, and the witness left. And all of us left, never to be reconvened again. No business or nonprofit would operate in this way. And I would also say to you, in addition to being a former business leader and a nonprofit operator, I also was a former teacher. I can tell you that the high school scheduling of high school classes is much more effectively run than the scheduling of Congress. This system is highly inefficient and is something that we have come to accept, but I don't believe that it needs to be this way. I think we can absolutely look at a way to schedule our lives so that it's more humane to us as Congress members and also to our constituents and to the people who work with us. I thank the committee very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a pleasure to be here. These modernizations efforts have nothing to do with technology and everything to do with common sense. I appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you get up, can I just ask, you mentioned the Shutdown to End All Shutdowns Act. What are the provisions in it? Can you walk us through this?
Sure. You know, there are a variety of different teeth that are put into it, mechanisms that require that after a 30-day cliff period, basically, that members of Congress and members of the executive branch go without pay, and they also, in the case of the committees, members of Congress have to come and gavel in effectively every day so that they aren't allowed to sort of go home to their communities. And I know that's fairly draconian. I know it's fairly draconian to ask people not to go without pay. And one of the things that was remarkable and talking to people about this on the floor was people said, well, I can't live without my pay. And that was a pretty remarkable statement coming from people who are asking regular humans in our community and in our country to go without pay. So that's effectively the teeth of it. There also are things like that gyms are shut down and golf courses are no longer available to members of Congress. And of course there are provisions if there were emergency travel that was required or even travel back and forth to the district that is still allowed. But it's a relatively thoughtful set of treatments or recourse to make sure that people in Congress really think twice before doing this to one another again.
Thank you.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you very much for the chance to speak with you all.
Thank you for your testimony. We have probably about a 3 or 4 minute break before our next person arrives to testify, so we'll just go at ease for a few minutes until they arrive.
Yeah, we can do it right. Well, that's good. They're convergent, right? So they're convergent. All the historical Are you going to shut down the government? Like, you kind of would like weird. Would that be nice? Like that? Which members are right? Let's go to the right way. That would not affect other people, right? Yeah. What should we punish? Yeah. That's a whole other thing. That's a crystal ball. Was that? Huh. Well, we need gold ones. I guess it doesn't. Today's like the day, because there was Amelia's appropriations. That was all the, have you read the written summary? No. Should, read the first and see it. There's a lot of stuff in there that you guys should like this stuff. Yeah. They're going to get their they're going to testify. They're going to testify. And it's still going to work. It'll be interesting.
We're going to get cooking. All right, the committee will come back to order. The committee now welcomes the testimony of Congresswoman Cindy Axne from the state of Iowa. Without objection, your written statement will be part of the record, and you're now recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Thank you for allowing me to testify before you today. I decided to run for office not to make headlines, not to shout at pundits on cable news shows, but because truly I was fed up. I was fed up with the decisions that were being made here in Washington that are hurting our families. And I was fed up with Washington dysfunction that's taking us backwards. I haven't been here that long, but the dysfunction is worse than I thought it would be. And frankly, I'm disappointed. Because I believe that if Iowans knew the extent of this dysfunction, they'd be just as shocked as I am. And they'd demand change immediately. And so that's why I'm here today, to help clean up Washington. First, it's the amount of wasteful spending that's gone unnoticed for years. I spent a decade at the state of Iowa directing initiatives, key strategies for the state to improve services while saving taxpayer dollars. And I know how to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. And the amount of waste, fraud, and abuse I've seen here in Washington is shocking. Because when it comes to decorating offices and suites, high-ranking government officials shouldn't have a blank check. And Iowans deserve to know that their hard-earned tax dollars are being used to benefit the public good, not to decorate an office. So I join my colleagues in introducing a bill to rein in that excessive and frivolous spending. That legislation would save taxpayer dollars, bring much-needed transparency when it comes to federal agency heads' excessive spending, and create real consequences for officials who break the rules. So, Mr. Chairman, I would ask that you support that legislation. And politicians have become accustomed to using taxpayer dollars for first-class flights on airlines. And Iowans would be shocked to know that members of Congress have also spent upwards of $20,000 on paintings of themselves. I've said from day one that we need to put our resources where our values are. Well, my values lie with the constituents of the 3rd District of Iowa, and I know that the 3rd District would not want me to make politicians have an opportunity for luxury travel or lavish oil paintings. I've seen politicians quick to spend taxpayer dollars on themselves, but when it comes to our constituents, I've seen Washington work at a very glacial pace. When our office voicemail filled up over a long weekend, we were told it would cost tax dollars if we wanted to hear from more of our constituents. Or when Sue from Des Moines needed a local number from the Social Security office because her husband passed away, she couldn't find that online, and then she got lost in the switchboard. She finally contacted my office only because my staff was able to place a call to a special congressional line to assist her, was she able to get through. And that type of congressional dysfunction is really hurting Iowans, and I'd like to see us fix that. But when I talk to folks back home about Washington dysfunction, lately I like to tell them about an archaic procedural process used for partisan purposes. It's called a motion to recommit, or an MTR. And it's like any other amendment to a bill, but the difference is, by supporting an MTR, you're returning that bill back to committee and you're delaying it. And the language of the MTR isn't made public until we're actually voting for it on the floor. The American people deserve more out of their elected officials, and they need to know that their elected officials have time to properly read the bills that they're voting on. This year and in the past, we've seen MTRs introduced in bad faith to undermine legislation and create fodder for partisan political attacks. The MTR does not support transparent government. It is a process that denies our constituents the right to be heard. Indeed, we have a problem when a politician introduces an MTR to a bill, then sees its inclusion in the bill as requested, but then votes against the final passage of the bill. It's like if you go to a car dealership to buy a car, and you ask for all those upgrades to that same vehicle. Then once those upgrades are made, you don't buy the car because you had no intention of purchasing that vehicle to begin with. My fellow freshmen and I were sent here to clean up government so that it works for the people in this country. And we need to end the use of the MTR so that both sides can debate their views openly and sincerely, not waste taxpayer dollars by playing political games with legislation. So I've called on leadership to change this. And as a small business owner, when I see an issue in my own company that's preventing successful outcomes, we make changes quickly. There's no organization in the country that would continue with a process that doesn't work. The MTR doesn't work. My district, my state, and the American people deserve the same out of Congress. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for your testimony. And with that, the committee now welcomes the testimony of Congresswoman Terry Sewell from the state of Alabama. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for taking my testimony today. We all know that I'm pretty loud. I was once a cheerleader. I was pretty loud. Okay. As all of you know, because you're my colleagues. We all know that the 116th Congress is historic. 127 women fill the halls of Congress, and the Democratic caucus is the most diverse ever. Now, as we adjust to being in the majority, it's important that we look at how we can uplift diverse voices and experiences of members and their constituents to make sure that this historic Congress is truly inclusive. I am encouraged that the new committee on caucus procedures is taking steps to ensure that the rules are transparent, fair, and consider the philosophical and geographical differences of our caucus. Representation matters. I'd like to believe that there have been 3 cases of divine intervention in my life. The first was the opportunity to go to an undergraduate college that really changed my life. And during my time at that college, I had an opportunity to interview with Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African-American woman to walk the halls of Congress. It was very formative for me. But that experience also led to the experience that I had as a summer intern for my member of Congress, who actually held the exact seat that I hold right now. That member of Congress was Richard Shelby. Richard Shelby was my congressman, and I worked for him not 1 summer, but 3 summers. I think that one way that we in Congress can really put our money where our mouth is in action is giving young people, young constituents of ours, an opportunity to really understand the inner workings of this place. It wasn't until I worked for Shelby that I actually got to see day in and day out what a member of Congress does. And 20 plus years later, I am now the member of Congress representing the 7th Congressional District. I'm saying this to say I was really disheartened when I became a member of Congress and found out that we had gotten rid of the House Page program. And I know the Senate still has their Page program. And I know that one of the reasons why we got rid of that House Page program is because we said that a lot of things had become more electronic and we were not moving as much paper anymore and didn't have the need. But I really think that if we're thinking about how to modernize Congress and to think about how today's Congress could help in future development of our constituents, I think that it's a wonderful opportunity for us to reconsider having a House Page program. I do know that it costs money, but I also know that we spend money on what we value, and we can find resources when we need resources. And I think an opportunity to have young people work in Congress is worth having. I can truly say that I would not be a member of Congress today if I had not had a great internship. And while I think it's important that we've made a really big step forward in doing paid internships, and we're all excited about having resources to this summer have paid internships, I think that it's not enough that we just do our part in our own congressional offices. An opportunity to see the inner workings of this Congress and all that that means, and understanding how one can serve one's country through public service is an important proposition. I think all of us are here because of that. So I'd like for us to consider bringing back the House Page program. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. And with that, the committee now welcomes Dan Lipinski from the state of Illinois. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. You've got 5 minutes.
Thank you for the invitation to testify. My past work as a professor of American government whose teaching and research focused on Congress, combined with my 14-plus years in the House, gives me a unique understanding of how the House does, or unfortunately, does not work. Whenever I'm teaching about Congress, I begin by showing the I'm Just a Bill Schoolhouse Rock video, the famous 3-minute cartoon of how a bill becomes a law. Bill starts as an idea that comes from a constituent to their representative who writes a bill. Bill works his way through the process and eventually becomes law. Sadly, that's rarely the way Congress works today. Our Constitution empowered the American people by empowering Congress. But the House is now rigged in a way that greatly diminishes members' abilities to represent our constituents. As a result, Congress often doesn't work, allowing the president and the courts to grab power that is supposed to be held by the American people. This must change. I'm a member of the bipartisan House Problem Solvers Caucus, and last year we put forward a package of reforms to facilitate consensus-driven governing and foster passage of individual member initiatives. Some of our reforms were adopted in the rules package for the 116th Congress, and I thank Speaker Pelosi and Chairman McGovern for working with us on these changes. As a result of this work, any bill that gains co-sponsorship of 2/3 of the House will now be put on a new consensus calendar, and bills on this calendar will be considered on the floor on a regular basis. In addition, bipartisan initiatives are now encouraged in the Rules Committee through a protocol that gives priority to amendments with at least 20 Democratic and 20 Republican co-sponsors. These reforms were a start. They marked the first time in decades that House rules moved toward empowering rank-and-file members. Now, I encourage this committee to go further and to be bold. So I'm going to start with bold. First, make the Rules Committee protocol that prioritizes bipartisan amendments a requirement and put it in the House rules. I'd also encourage lowering the required number of members to 10 or 5 from each side in order to encourage consensus policymaking. While doing this to open the process to minority party input, I'd recommend eliminating the motion to recommit, which no longer serves the purpose of giving the minority party an opportunity to shape legislation. In order to empower rank-and-file members, committees should be empowered. Committees are where members have the most policymaking expertise and where they can have the greatest impact if committees are allowed to do their work. One way to empower committees is to guarantee floor consideration for any bill that passes a committee. In addition, to make sure that all committees with jurisdiction on a bill have their say, a majority vote in committee should be required to waive jurisdiction on a piece of legislation. As committees are empowered, subcommittees can also have their power increased. Subcommittee chairs and ranking members should have authority to hire staff for that subcommittee. Knowledge is power, and members gain knowledge through staff. Giving subcommittee leaders the ability to hire staff would expand the opportunity to shape the House agenda to more members. The importance of talented staff to every member cannot be overlooked. Significant cuts to member representational allowances in 2011, 12, and 13 have undermined the ability of members to represent their constituents. If a member does not have enough expert staff, they lack the ability to develop their own legislation, offer amendments, and make good decisions in representing their constituents. Additionally, we should reestablish the Office of Technology Assessment, which provides Congress with analysis of scientific and technology issues, but was defunded in 1995. Finally, many have talked about the lack of collegiality among members because of the lack of opportunities to develop relationships across the aisle. I'd recommend reviving the bipartisan retreat and creating more opportunities for members to travel together or otherwise spend time with colleagues of the other party. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, we have a very large class of new House members who are eager to have an impact. It has injected a lot of much-needed energy into the body, which is good because the American people need Congress to work. But unless we institute reforms that open up the policymaking process and empower rank-and-file members, we will simply be spokespeople, not policymakers. We cannot let this happen. Let's reform this House and give power back to the American people. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for your testimony and for your work on this for quite some time, so thank you. With that, let me invite up Chairman Benny Thompson from the state of Mississippi. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, and you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and other members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify before the committee today to share my input on creating new rules and policies to help modernize the legislative branch. Last Congress, I introduced legislation entitled No Couches for Congress Act. This bill amends the rules of the House of Representatives to, 1, prohibit members of the House from using congressional offices or official House resources for personal overnight accommodations. Secondly, it requires the House Committee on Ethics to respond to complaints filed by members of the House. Additionally, this bill was introduced as a result of 2 unanswered complaint letters from 31 members of Congress, including myself, that were sent to the House Ethics Committee questioning the legality and propriety of a significant number of members choosing to use their congressional offices as overnight lodging facilities. Despite drawing an annual salary of over $174,000, over 50 members of Congress admitted to sleeping in their offices in 2018. Members who sleep overnight in their offices receive free lodging, free cable, free security, free cleaning services, and utilize other utilities free of charge in direct violation of the ethics rules which prohibit official resources from being used for personal purposes. It has been previously reported that members who use their offices for lodging may be receiving free government benefit worth up to 10% of their salary. Continuing to maintain a personal residence in congressional offices, using congressional resources for personal use, and increasing or interfering with the work of housekeeping and maintenance staff brings discredit to the House and blatantly violates House ethics rules. Additionally, members maintaining a personal residence within House office building creates a potentially hostile work environment for employees that work within the building. The actions of these members raise several obvious and potential violations that reflect negatively upon the decorum and credibility of the House as a body and as an institution. This practice calls into question the ethical standards set by the House and should be investigated and evaluated. I ask that this committee consider developing and implementing new rules and policies that will end the practice of members sleeping in their offices to help promote a more efficient Congress. Furthermore, we should inquire whether members are treated differently than other federal employees with respect to Treasury laws, per diem requirements in high-income areas, and other benefits presently available. Thank you for your time, for allowing me to share my input on this matter, and I look forward to your response.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. With that, the committee now welcomes the testimony of Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy from the state of Florida. And without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, and members of the committee, thank you for your service on this important committee and for seeking input from individual members at your first meeting. Consistent with my belief that Congress would function better if members of Congress, myself included, were a little less long-winded, I promise to be concise. I intend to yield back the balance of my time, probably the rarest comment in congressional lexicon, although probably the most appreciated. I'm proud to be a member of Congress because it gives me the opportunity to serve this country and help my constituents. However, this institution is not held in high esteem by the American people. Its popularity rivals that of rodents and rashes, according to recent polls. And too often, the perception that Congress is broken is matched by reality. This creates a sense of cynicism and pessimism among our citizenry, and it causes people, especially younger people, to disengage from the democratic process because they feel disillusioned or even disgusted. Our democracy is not self-sustaining. It depends on engaged and informed electorate. It needs honorable people who are inspired to choose the path of public service, and that's why it's important for government to repair its reputation. Let me be clear, however, the most important change we can make in Congress is beyond the power of any committee to propose or impose. It cannot be achieved by tinkering with some arcane congressional rule or procedure. It's about how we in this institution act and how we treat one another. This is not a call for members to suppress the vigorous debate we're conducting over principles and policies and the best direction for this country. It's simply a request that we treat one another with respect. that we comport ourselves in a way that does not further inflame tensions or sharpen divisions in this country, that we view one another not as adversaries, but as fellow Americans. In terms of practices and procedures, I have two broad recommendations that I hope the committee will consider. First, Congress has the power of the purse, and it's an awesome responsibility. Without a budget, though, Congress is like a teenager who's been given a credit card with no limit. And if they don't have a budget, they'll spend recklessly beyond their means. To reimpose some fiscal discipline, I respectfully ask the committee to review and adopt the bipartisan recommendations made last Congress by the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform. These include biennial budgeting and an annual hearing on the fiscal state of the nation. Second, oversight of the executive branch is a key congressional responsibility, and committee staff are instrumental in this role. They're talented and diligent. However, we need to be sure that we're right-sizing staffing levels to their oversight responsibilities. For example, how are several dozen staffers on the Armed Services or Intel committees supposed to provide effective oversight of the gigantic defense or intelligence communities that Additionally, staff would cost money, or adding staff would cost money, of course, but that cost could be more than offset through stronger oversight of executive actions, including waste, fraud, and abuse. I thank the committee for allowing me to testify and for the time and energy you've dedicated to this noble mission, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. And you kept good to your word. You had 2 minutes left. With that, let me invite up Lauren Underwood from the state of Illinois. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm so glad that the new Congress is focusing on making reforms to bring this body into the 21st century. I'm also glad to have this opportunity to share my priorities formally at Member Day. This is my first Member Day, and I've already worked with many of the people on the Select Committee on these issues, and I'm looking forward to continuing to do so. Congress has been a hostile place for women to work for far too long, and modernizing Congress will require us to change that. I'm focused on enacting policies that will help expose and prevent workplace misconduct and harassment in the halls of Congress. I believe this focus impacts multiple areas where this committee stated that is looking to make improvements. It will help improve staff retention, increase staff diversity and recruitment, and will certainly promote a more modern Congress. My first legislative success as a freshman came on the very first day of this 116th Congress, when the newly Democratic House passed a rules package that included 2 amendments that I authored. The first amendment prohibited the use of non-disclosure agreements to silence victims of workplace misconduct. The second amendment prohibited romantic relationships between committee staff and members who served on that committee. Now, in some ways, it's shocking, honestly, that these 2 practices weren't banned until 2 months ago. But I'm pleased that Leader Pelosi, Representative Speer, and others worked with me to fix that. However, much more work remains to be done, and I'm here today to talk about 2 other amendments that I authored to make Congress more transparent and accountable. The first is about Ethics Committee reports. Now, this is Sunshine Week in the U.S. House, and the Ethics Committee is charged with investigating potential official misconduct violations by members of Congress, including harassment and sexual assault. Now, right now, to my understanding, the investigation stops in the Ethics Committee when the member resigns, so that the member who is credibly accused of, say, pressuring a young female aide to conceive a child with him is not accountable to the public. Taxpayers paid his salary while the alleged misconduct happened, but then they can't see the ethics report. It's just not right. My proposal expands the Ethics Committee's investigatory jurisdiction and required reports. It would allow ethics to finalize any report and release it publicly on its findings, even if a member resigns, and if the report is substantially completed by the time the member leaves office. It would also require the Ethics Committee to conclude investigations of a member who retires, resigns, or is expelled within 1 year of leaving office. Lastly, it will require the Ethics Committee to make its report public once it's concluded, while ensuring the victims' identities are protected. Now, I've been told that the Ethics Committee has some questions about the constitutional issues that arise here, and I'm looking forward to working with them to address those and ensure that these reports can be made public. But this issue is too important to remain unaddressed any longer, and I do think that there is an opportunity for this committee to weigh in. Now, the second proposal is about a rape shield provision. It would bring Congress in line with these rape shield laws that passed as part of the Violence Against Women Act in '94. With VAWA reauthorization on the floor in the next few weeks, this issue is especially timely. Rape shield laws are intended to prevent offenders from using a victim's past sexual conduct or relationships against them. And we know that this information is really relevant, or is rarely relevant in the context of investigations, and it's really irrelevant to fact-finding, and it's primarily used to target and intimidate victims. Rape shield laws currently apply to civil and criminal proceedings, but they don't apply to congressional proceedings, such as investigations, to roundtables, and to hearings. And so it's my opinion that we have to close this loophole here in the House and to ensure that Congress is finally subject to the same standard that it rightly applies to our court system when the VAWA legislation passed almost a quarter century ago. So again, there's an important ethics provision and these rape shield laws that I would encourage the committee to take up and look at, and I thank you so much for the opportunity to weigh in. And I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony and for engaging on these issues from day one. Good for you. Thank you. With that, let me invite up Catherine Clark from the state of Massachusetts. We welcome your testimony, and without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chair Graves, and members of the committee for the opportunity to come before you today and share some of my thoughts on how we can modernize our Congress. My focus really is that we don't have enough staff. We have lost between 1980 and 2014 a tremendous amount of staff, and our committees now employ roughly half as many staffers as they did in 1980. We pay our staff less. Our professional staff salaries, when adjusted for inflation, have gone down 12%. For legislative directors, it's gone down 6%. And salary for legislative assistants went down 6%. We've also increased work, and we therefore retain staff for shorter periods of time. A 2016 survey of the House staff found that 50% of House legislative directors have been in their positions for less than 2 years. And the median tenure for House LAs is just over 1 year. Simply put, we don't have enough staff to do our jobs. The staff we have are underpaid, and they don't stay very long. I would urge this committee to explore investing in our committees. In order to handle the complexities of overseeing the executive branch and ensure the legislation that we pass is fully vetted and understood, I think it is time for a significant investment in our committee staff. And I would encourage this committee to provide recommendations on how we can increase staff pay, incentivize staff retention, and significantly increase the overall number of committee staff. We also have to look at staff salaries, and I believe that the MRA is a problem in the way that it is making the overall cap makes for hard choices between communicating with our constituents at home and paying our experienced staff a living wage in DC. So I think there are several things that we can do. I would urge that we consider funding the MRA back at the 2010 funding level of $660 million, and that the lifetime cap on House Student Loan Repayment Assistance Program be restored to $80,000. I would urge this committee to consider proposals that would divide the MRA into two separate line items, one account exclusively for staff salaries. The baseline for this separate account should be set using the highest paying offices, and I would urge that you look at incorporating an automatic cost of living increase. To improve staff retention, I'd recommend that we look at longevity incentives directly to employees outside of the MRA, and it could be something as simple as the House providing an additional $100 a month to staffers' salary for every year of service out of non-MRA funds. And we all know that staff retention is about far more than just pay. It means enabling staffers to stay once they decide to have a family. The House took a significant steps towards supporting our staff with families with the expansion of the House Child Care Center. And I think that we should continue to expand that center until capacity, the center's capacity until demand is fully met. But we also have to make sure that we have good family leave policy across the House. As you are keenly aware, that is entirely dependent currently on the policies in individual members' office. I think that this committee should consider establishing a House-wide policy that guarantees the right of staff to take paid family leave, and that these policies come with the resources necessary for individual offices to pay for them, and that we do not implement the lowest common denominator, that offices that wish to provide generous paid leave should also have the flexibility to do so. Simple things that we can make, I would urge that we look at changing tables throughout the complex in both men and women's restrooms. And I have heard from several members with small children that it would be of great value to them that members with children under the age of 15, because that is the unaccompanied minor limit for airlines, could utilize the government rate on flights to and from DC. This change would help members more easily coordinate their flights and have their children be with them while they're on official duty. I also think we need to look at the district office rental cost formula in the MRA for districts like mine, where there's no available federal government office space and an exceptionally high market rate for rental space. It can be a significant challenge to find district space that we can afford and allows us to best serve our constituents. Insufficient funding is just one more factor that puts pressure on what we are able to pay our staff. And finally, modernizing the franking rules to accommodate social media communication. I certainly appreciate and agree that taxpayer resources should never be used to engage in political messaging, but current franking rules make it very difficult to communicate effectively with our constituents because we are often forced to maintain two separate accounts for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I hope this committee can perform a comprehensive review of the franking rules as they relate to social media and consider reforms like allowing members to communicate via a single media account so we can most effectively communicate with constituents while maintaining the prohibition against using official time and taxpayer resources for political purposes. Finally, I just urge you to think big. I know that you are. This is an incredible opportunity for us to regain our status as a co-equal branch of government, and we can begin by starting by treating ourselves as such. It's going to require big ideas and big investments, and I am very grateful that you are putting your time into this effort. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Batting cleanup, the committee now welcomes the testimony of Congressman Daniel Webster from the state of Florida. Without objection, your written testimony will be made part of the record. Thank you for showing up early, too. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Vice Chair, members, committee. A good widget maker, when producing flawed widgets, is going to make a change. But What if the change the maker decides is offering additional colors, or repackaging his widget, or special pricing, or employing new marketing techniques like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram? While well-intended, none of these improvements are going to fix the flawed product, the flawed widget. It's the process by which widgets are made that is flawed. If the process is flawed, the product is going to be flawed. The only way to improve the product is to fix the process. The process of producing policy in Congress is flawed. The process itself kills policy ideas through truncated rules and procedural decisions that limit discussion. As a result, Congress is passing flawed public policy. The only way to make good public policy is to fix the process. This requires transforming the way Congress does business. It requires ending a process based on the traditional pyramid of power, where a few people at the top of the pyramid make most of the decisions. It requires replacing a power-based system with a process that is focused on principles. Power focuses on self-preservation. Principle focuses on making ideas successful. Power tends to protect itself merely to maintain its own status and control. Principle gives up power for the sake of the highest good and to create the best public policy. Power demands to be heard. Principle earns the right to be heard. Power focuses on rights. Principle focuses on responsibilities. One of the most significant contrasts between power and principle is how it treats policy. Power tends to view an idea based on the position, rank, loyalty, and seniority of the sponsor. Principle focuses solely on the merits of the idea itself. There are three changes that would move us toward a more principle-based, member-driven process. Number one, deal with the most important issues first. Congress allocates annual funding from the government through appropriation process with 12 bills, but it's common under both parties to roll some or all of those bills into one big vote close to the deadline that's coming. We're running out of time, we're going to shut down government or whatever it is. I advocate for completing this process on time and in the daylight, giving members acting on the behalf of their constituents an opportunity to set priorities for government. Number two, renew, reform, or consolidate expiring or getting ready to expire or already expired programs. After programs sunset, a myriad continues to receive funding annually almost as an automatic basis. In order to better serve the American people and bringing transparency to the annual funding process, committees should be tasked with creating a schedule to review, update, and reauthorize these programs. And last, number three, allow members to legislate. Stick to a deliberative but reasonable process of hearing bills that actually follows the House rules. Each congressional district contains approximately the same number of citizens. Each representative ought to be empowered to represent the specific needs of their district. Not every bill or amendment will be successful, though every member will have the opportunity to gain support for their ideas from their colleagues. I have with me a copy of the rules, 46 pages. I hope you've read them. It's a great document. It's based on principle. We don't use it. Every day we either do suspensions. What are we suspending? The rules. Or we do another rule in this very room that governs the conduct on the floor of the House when this gets circumvented. So that rule replaces these rules. Anyway, I bring it as evidence that we ought to be doing it. So this is it. You know, this is our moment. This committee doesn't happen every Congress, so it's pretty awesome it's happening. I'm glad each one of you are serving on it. I'm glad you're looking into these items. This is a moment in time. Power and principle can't coexist. So which will it be? Flawed widgets or solid principles? Yield back.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. A way to stick the landing at exactly 5 minutes. With that, I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response, and we'll ask our witnesses to respond as promptly as able. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I also just want to say thank you to the Rules Committee, the Rules staff, for their room and for their assistance, and Jessica, our borrowed clerk and transcriptionist. I apologize if I don't enunciate well, but we're very grateful for you stepping in and helping us out. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.